Hello, and welcome to the afternoon session of the Moss Adams Private Foundation Virtual Conference, Day 2. We are pleased that you were able to join us. We have 3 presentations this afternoon, totaling 3 CPE credits for this portion of today's conference. For the National Association of State Boards of Accountancy, to qualify for these credits, you must attend each session for a minimum of 50 minutes and respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions in each session. And before we get started with our afternoon session, I'm going to play our housekeeping video.
Welcome, and thank you for viewing our webcast series. Before we begin, please keep the following in mind. You can customize how you view our presentation and interact with the presenter. For better viewing, close all other applications and turn up your speaker volume. You can adjust window size and placement, or enter full screen mode using the controls at the top right of the window or dragging the bottom right-hand corner to resize. At the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons that relate to a different aspect of our session. You can download a PDF of today's slides from the Slide Deck and Handouts widget. You can ask questions by typing in the Q&A window and clicking Submit. We'll do our best to answer all questions or follow up via email. If you experience technical difficulty, refresh your browser by hitting the F5 key. This presentation is not legal, investment, or accounting advice. We encourage you to seek the counsel of a professional service provider to apply this content to your specific circumstances.
All right, and sorry about that. Looks like someone got a hold of the slides, so apologies on that. And now I would like to turn it over to Wendy Campos, Partner and Foundation's National Practice Leader, to get our conference started.
Great. Thank you, Amy. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our afternoon sessions as part of our Private Foundation Conference. If you joined this morning, welcome back. And if you're just joining, welcome. I hope we left you with great insights this morning. And with that, I do want to lead into our current session. This is exciting. We've got some foundation representatives and our partner from Moss Adams, Kinman Tong, embedding and operationalizing DEIBJ in our missions and programs. This is going to be a wonderful session, I just know. With that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kinman.
Thank you, Wendy. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our panel. My name is Kinman Tong. I use he, his pronouns. I'm a partner at Moss Adams and member of our Moss Adams Inclusion and Diversity Board, which drives our strategy and goal of becoming an anti-racist firm. I've also been fortunate to be involved with our Moss Adams Foundation work that also involves the work in DEIBJ. And DEIBJ, diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and justice has been a foundation of a lot of the work that we do. And I'm excited to welcome our 3 panelists, Illyasha, Peete, Tanir, and Ken Oliver, to kind of talk about their role and involvement in DEIBJ as they work with their foundation. I'll let them introduce themselves shortly after this. But DEIBJ shows up everywhere in the news, in the corporate world, in a lot of the things that we do, especially in the world of philanthropy, charitable giving, and also nonprofit work. A lot of this has been a lot of tuck and pull that we are seeing in the various community, unfortunately, in the political environment, the economic space as well, and how philanthropy can have a big role in driving meaningful and sustainable momentum in a lot of our DEIBJ work. And we're using this just to be inclusive in the work that we do in this space. And because of that, we see a lot of this big role being filled by foundations who are grant makers, who are driver of a lot of the programming effort, and excited to hear from our panelists about how we all can dig in more into this or enhance our work in this space. And I'll just start off with, as the panelists introduce themselves, one of the questions that I hope you can also answer is, what motivated you or drive you in the work that you lean in on for DEIBJ, in the work that you work with in your foundation? And maybe we'll start with Tanir.
Thank you, Kinman. So my name is Tanir Ami. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the CEO of the CARESTAR Foundation. We focus on emergency response improvements and transformational work with a racial equity lens. I've been doing this work at this foundation for about 5 years now, and that's exactly how old the foundation is. And my main motivations, just from a professional perspective, sort of started when I got my first job out of graduate school, actually with the Blue Shield of California Foundation. And I'd never worked at a foundation before. It was really an interesting experience. And one that was, and this was, 20 years ago, one that led me to believe that foundations were just a little bit, I felt like they were a little bit out of touch with sort of what was really happening in communities. And I really struggled and actually pivoted and began working in the nonprofit sector again, and done that for sort of the intermediate kind of 20 years. And when I was ready for a change and got recruited to be the CEO of the foundation, I remember having a lot of reluctance to go back into a field that I felt, again, was sort of out of touch and very removed, a little, I would use the word kind of entitled. And I made a commitment to myself that either I would lean in completely and entirely and bring the board on a racial equity journey, or that I would not continue to work in philanthropy. And so I'm delighted to say that 5 years later, I'm still here, and it's been an interesting journey. We'll talk about it more later, but for me, it was a deep desire to continue to bring equity work and particularly an equity framework into the philanthropic field.
That's great, Tanir, and that's definitely insightful, given the fact that I've had the fortune of working with you in the not-for-profit space before this. So glad to see your journey in that as well. Ken, what about yourself? How did you come to this work at Checkr Foundation?
Thank you. I appreciate that, Kinman. Great to be here. My journey here is kind of interesting. I have some proximate leadership and directly impacted experience myself with the justice system. And Checkr, being one of the leading background check companies in the country, really wanted to, after they took the 1% pledge, operationalize a corporate foundation so they could advance an equity lens into the workforce and the future of work for justice impacted folks. And so they had kind of been doing it under the radar for about 8 years, hiring people that had been impacted by the justice system who had some type of arrest or conviction history, primarily Black and brown folks who represented disparate group in that category. They wanted to double down on proximate leadership, which they wanted somebody who had some proximity to the issues that they thought could actually provide some of the solutions. And I was fresh off of a partnership with Governor Newsom and the California legislature in building out a tech training program for justice impacted men and women in California and providing pathways into the knowledge-based economy. And Checkr tapped me to build out this kind of program, both on the corporate side and on the foundation side, so that way they could evangelize this work across the country. So this work hits me near and dear as a Black man in this country, where 36% of people like me have some type of arrest or conviction history in this country. So bringing an equity lens and providing space for folks to get reskilled and upskilled and pathwayed into a place where they've traditionally been boxed out is near and dear to my heart. And so that's why I do it with everything I got.
Thanks, Ken, and it's kind of interesting that you also bring your experience with the government side into your work as well in your exposure to that. So that's great.
Yeah, sure. I mean, did a lot of policy work, and policy has really served me well in designing some of the strategies I've done, both on the social impact side with the corporation, and then also on the foundation side. Even though we don't directly lobby ourselves, we do have our hands in some of the stuff that happens in reference to criminal justice reform in the state of California and elsewhere.
Awesome. Final but not least, Illy, what about yourself? Introduce yourself and your journey.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you come to us from. My name is Illyasha Peete. Most people refer to me as Illy. My pronouns are she, her, and I am honored to be here on this wonderful panel to discuss a topic that not only that's not only professionally important to me, but also personally significant. I'm the former Chief of Equity and Justice of Culture at ClimateWorks Foundation, and I currently operate my own consulting practice that's based in what I call the principles of ideal. My career, I've had the opportunity to lead significant initiatives at different organizations and projects to help build DEI committees or ideal committees or whatever you call it. It doesn't really matter. It's all the same. It's all the same, going the same pathway. I do this work because it's a part of who I am. My parents were part of the civil rights movement, and they instilled in me the need to be a part of something greater than myself. And going to go and do kind of a little bit of a different dive of my experience. I grew up in the South as a tennis player. And for those of you that know about the Jim Crow South, me being a tennis player in the South was not typical. Upon graduation, I started my own nonprofit that put tennis rackets in the hands of Black and brown people. And I had first generation kids go to college on college scholarships because of that. As I moved forward, I was the VP of Consulting and Ideal at Center for Excellence in Nonprofits, where I had the opportunity to work with thousands of nonprofit leaders, emerging leaders, and board members. I served as the Executive Director for Racial and Social Equity at California Life Sciences, where my goal was to get Black and brown people within the life sciences industry from internships, paid internship level, to board service levels. And then as the Chief of Equity, Justice, and Culture at ClimateWorks Foundation, my job was to get funds to people in the global South in a way that was not extractive. So I look forward to the conversation, and I'm happy to be here.
Thanks, Illy. Amy, I think we have the first polling questions for our attendees.
Yes, so the first polling question for this session is, which aspect do you think is the most challenging for foundations when it comes to embedding DEIBJ in our missions and programs? And your options are A, defining clear goals and objectives, B, overcoming internal resistance, C, building authentic community partnerships, D, measuring the impact of the efforts, or E, all of the above. And just a reminder, you're going to want to click the button next to the answer you choose and then make sure to hit submit so that it records your response.
Yeah. I feel like this question was set up to kind of build on for our next discussion. So I'm curious to see what our attendees experience are, or at least perspective are, in terms of challenges. Which we'll dive right in once we get everyone's submission here shortly.
Yeah, we'll do a few more seconds here. All right, here are the results.
All right, as expected, I would expect most folks have the perspective of all of these are definitely challenges and challenges that everyone has kind of faced in kind of embedding DEIBJ in their work. So, kind of looking at each of us here, what are some of the challenges that you all have kind of experienced in terms of trying to do this work or been doing this work? And maybe we'll start with you, Illy, in the last, maybe at ClimateWorks or even last year in the organization, what kind of challenges have you seen?
So I just want to start out by saying this work is challenging and ever changing, and you're going to make mistakes. You have to be willing to apologize, pivot, and move on. That's the biggest lesson that I can offer from all the experience that I've had so far. It's also important that we move away from decisions and structures and thoughts that center white dominant culture. We have to dismantle current systems and work in community to rebuild them in a way that provides access to all of us. Some other things that I would point to very quickly are we have to address our resistance to change in organizations, especially foundations. That's something that I've seen come up a lot. There is also a consistent lack of understanding for the need for this work. So it has to be addressed and then consistently reinforced. I find it critical to avoid tokenism. A lot of times we hire one person of color to do the job of a team, and we expect them to get it done in 90 days, something that we haven't been able to do in hundreds of years, I might add. The other thing is we have a desire to get things done, but we won't provide resources. And what we know is things that are important to us, we provide money and support for. Got a few other things I'm going to mention. Just as important is that we have to measure success. We have to measure success and missteps so we know how to recalibrate to keep the work going effectively. We want to make sure that we're bringing the community in so that we're creating authentic relationships that help us consistently build on the work that we're doing. And then we need to discuss power dynamics and internal biases. And that is not a singular training. It is an ongoing training and conversation that helps us break down communication barriers. So those are the things that I would suggest, and things that we really need to stay aware of as we do this work. Something else just came to me, and I'm going to mention it as well. I think we have to think about our cultural nuances, because as we bring in new people from different places, we can't have them land in a culture that wasn't built to include them.
Yeah, and I think those are definitely things that I have seen in working within organizations, or even in organizations that I've served and whatnot, has struggles, right? Both internal and external, that we continue to see. Tanir, Ken, anything else to add?
I'll take a quick stab. I can't do much better than Lily did. She's a hard act to follow because she nailed most of the touch points. But I will say that from a foundational aspect, I'm kind of in an interesting position because I wear two hats. I'm on the social impact side of the company, but then I'm also the executive director of the foundation. So from a foundational aspect, it's interesting because our work is primarily based on DEIBJ, right? Fair chance hiring and creating fair employment opportunities for people impacted by the justice system, which is predominantly disproportionately people of color. So it's built into our ethos and our mission and our work that we do that. But then on the corporate side, it's a little different, right? Because I'm looking at the tech ecosystem, and the numbers aren't exactly numbers to write home about when we talk about internal corporate D&I practices, especially in the tech sector. And so I think that's been a little bit of a harder struggle with some of the things that Lily mentioned. Intention is a big piece of it. Dispelling myths and fears. I happen to be at a company where there's a lot of robust conversation around whether you should even have equity in the D&I conversation. And that goes from lack of awareness, and it goes to a lack of understanding about the historical nature of what equity really means. It doesn't mean paying everybody the same thing. It means that you're providing space for people to have equal access in a way that they haven't before. And so it's a very different conversation on the foundation side versus the corporate side in the company that I sit, but I see it from both sides of it.
I would just add, I think, just tagging on to what Illy said really, really beautifully. The journey is messy, and so what we talk a lot about in this work. She mentioned the imperfection of it, and just kind of try again. I've noticed that that's definitely true, and just reminding myself to sit in that discomfort. We've lost a handful of board members in our journey at the foundation, and big picture, we know that if folks aren't ready to be on the path with us, then that's okay, and we need to just let that go and let that be. But the process of sort of getting there, and particularly losing board members, it's can be really painful in the long hours and days of that just those moments of discomfort can be pretty intense. And so just reminding ourselves of that, the day-to-dayness of it is often uncomfortable.
Yeah. And I think a lot of this challenge. Yeah.
And can I add something to what you said? I love the fact that you mentioned equity. I'm a person that believes in that. And I really see equity as getting people what they need. And I think as foundations start to understand that better, we'll do a better job of serving the people we're hoping to, period.
Yeah.
100%. Agree with that.
And a lot of these things are going to evolve, right? And sometimes I feel like we think we solve something, but it comes up in a different permutation as well, which is always the struggle, because you're like, I thought we solved this, and now it's showing up a different way, or in a different subset of the community that we are serving and whatnot. So that's good. Pivoting to kind of, talk about struggles, the challenges, the barriers and whatnot, our next polling question is about, what are the leading strategies or ideas, and maybe I'll just ask this question, which of the following strategies do you believe is most essential for foundations like ourselves to successfully integrate DEIBJ? Well, I'll say successfully do our best to integrate DEIBJ into our work, right? The first one is leadership, commitment, and accountability. Is it education and organization-wide support? Is it data collection and transparency reporting? Or is it collaborating with partner organization? And of course, the catch-all, all of the above. So please do submit your answers, because we do want to kind of get insights from our community members here to see which are the strategies that they all think is impactful. Because I feel like it also is an area that evolves around time, and also the journey of the organization itself. Let's see. We have more than half of you answering. All right. Thank you for the audience to confirm that, most of you agree that it's all of the above. And maybe, this is a question back, because based on what I have experienced, right, in a lot of the work that we do, we have benefited a lot on what we call, grassroots engagement, getting the grassroots effort in it, and then kind of pivot up to be more governed by a strong culture and infrastructure and goals. But I wanted to see, maybe Tanir can start, just how have you kind of brought along CARESTAR or anything else that you've done in this journey of DEIBJ being a big part of the work?
Yeah, it was a little hard for me to kind of think about this question. I love how you laid it out in the poll, but because, the journey is forever in some ways, it's hard to think about, oh yeah, did this and it was super successful. But I do want to start with leadership. For me, that's definitely where the journey begins. As I've already made reference to the board of directors that sort of needed to evolve pretty substantially in order to really start getting the work done. And then I think once we had a just phenomenal, fantastic board in place that was really ready to run, then the next thing for me was just working out some policies and trying to get policies in place that we could stand on and really lean on and look to as we continued to do the work. So for us, we just put into place policies around board recruitment. So making a commitment to only recruit folks to the board that were deeply committed and had demonstrated commitment to racial equity in their own personal lives. Getting that, putting pen to paper and getting the board to sign off on that was really helpful. And several other policies like vendor policies, staffing, hiring policies, financial investment policies. We just kind of went through, and that was stage one. And then you kind of gotta do the work, right? And lift it off of the papers and out of the words and kind of live it and breathe it. And then the other thing that I have found really helpful is we did bring consultants in to help us. We've been partnering with justice funders, particularly over several years now. And I really deeply appreciated having a partner on the journey. I do think it's helpful to just lean on someone when you're confused or tired, or, just want good sounding boards. I found that really helpful. And then just other things that I was sort of thinking about and reflecting just particularly is just the importance of pacing yourself, being kind to yourself during the journey. It does take longer than we all want it to, as Illy pointed out at the very beginning, and having a plan, right? So work your plan and be patient with yourself, and remember that this is a lifetime journey for all of us.
Yeah, it is definitely something that I think one of the things that you said is, in the community that you can support and leverage from is always helpful. I know that in a lot of the work that we do, a lot of it is collaboration. It's learning the leading practices from each other and build on it, because if somebody has failed, why not learn from that failure to gain the organization that you're at as well. So Ken, Illy, anything else to add in terms of other strategies that you think has been helpful?
Illy, you want to go first?
I surely can, if you like. So what I would say is, I think there are many things, but I'd start by reminding us that once you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation. So what works for this foundation might not work for the next. So you have to pick and choose different things for different organizations. But I would start by agreeing with what was said earlier. Leadership and government and governance are critical. Establishing a DEIBJ council, having executive sponsors, not just your CEO and your board, but executive sponsors throughout the organization. Strategy and planning, developing a strategy that is continuous, and having maybe a SWOT analysis to evaluate it. That's another thing. Transparency and accountability, that works into what I just mentioned. And what you can add with transparency and accountability is performance reviews and transparent reporting, even if you haven't reached the goals that you're hoping for. Employee resource groups. Let me stop there. When you have employee resource groups, shouldn't be a volunteer. You should offer compensation for it, because that's not a part necessarily of many of the people's jobs that are volunteering for that. One of the last things that I would think about was having open dialogue, creating brave spaces and places where you can provide feedback anonymously. And hopefully, as you grow and learn and become more together in the movement forward on this journey, perhaps they don't have to be anonymous anymore. Hopefully you'll get to a place where you can have open and frank and brave conversations about these things. So those are the things that I would start with. Ken, what would you add?
Yep. Well, I would just double click on what was said, especially about leadership and executive buy-in. I can't emphasize that enough. If there's not deep intention from the beginning, you're on a fast track to nowhere and spinning your wheel on the hamster wheel. So that's very important. And I think it's on us to press leadership when it's necessary. I think Tanir mentioned earlier her, pressing her board and holding some accountability there. I think, if we leave it to them to make the decision, when most of the time they may not have awareness, they may not, be educated in this area enough to make the proper decision and provide the proper resources and intention. So I would just double and triple click on that point right there, making sure that you have a leader that's going to support, you and your initiatives in this whole DEIBJ experience. For us, on the foundation side, some of the things that we focus on in reference to this is having a data-driven approach. So we really focus on the numbers of who we serve and who we impact and the companies we work with. We hold them accountable. We hold ourselves accountable. And we don't have any magic formula. We go by census and demographic numbers. And we want to reflect the fabric of the communities where we do business, right? And so whatever is in that community, that's kind of what we want to reflect. We want to make sure we represent the community. We want to make sure we serve the community and the populations that we serve. We also focus a lot on stakeholder engagement and proximate leadership. It's important to speak to the folks who are impacted. It's important to give them a seat at the table and allow them to have voice and talk about their lived experience and some of their pain points. And I think by doing that and centering that, right, we inform ourselves and we learn a lot, right? They have a lot to teach us about what we should be doing and not doing. They also provide a tremendous value proposition by way of innovation and solutions that people who aren't proximate typically don't have the vantage point of. So that really helps us in our approach. We bring stakeholders together on a regular basis. We speak to those people. We allow them to have space and decision-making with the directions that we go in, especially our grantees. So I would just add that and then stop there.
Awesome.
I want to say amen, Ken. Amen.
Yeah. This is definitely great. A lot of great suggestions on leading strategies and practices for a lot of us to consider. I mean, and some of it is just things that we just have to revisit as things evolve as well. The next polling questions is, we kind of talk about, it's interesting because the question is, which of these barriers do you think poses the biggest challenges for the foundations aiming to operationalize this? We can't talk about challenges, but these are, what are the barriers? And here, the first one, lack of diverse representation of leadership on the board. I think we addressed this a little bit already. Resistant to change. Change is hard, we know that. Difficulty in measuring impact. We talk about transparency, reporting, data-driven. Item D, external factors detracting support. We see a lot of that going on in the community right now. And of course, the catch-all of the above. We'll let our audience answer them because I think there's definitely, each of this has definitely barriers that every organization face at different, I think, juncture of the organization. And part of this is an evolution as well in terms of the work that the foundations do. And so I think it is an area that it would be good to see, if everyone agrees, one is more of a bigger threat than others. But let's see, I think that's almost there with everyone answering the questions. All right. More than half agree that all of these are definitely challenges, followed by the lack of diverse representation. I think that kind of addresses the question of making sure that we have our community, the diversity being represented there as well. But on the next question that I want to get insight from all of you is around metrics and assessment of impact, right? I think maybe we'll start with Illy. In terms of just talking about transparency reporting, how have you kind of worked with the foundation in measuring and assessing impact, and how has that worked?
Thanks so much for the question. I really appreciate it. And I think we, as a foundation, we are very good with quantitative metrics. And some suggest that they should not be a part of this work. I disagree. I think quantitative metrics are important. I think you can look at the diversity of recruitment, and then after you get people in, how long are they staying? And then as you do exit interviews, why did they leave? You could participate in demographics within the foundation, looking at those numbers and trying to increase it. You could look at your diversity of your vendors or your consultants that you're using. You could do surveys that talk about the work culture and team member satisfaction. I also believe in qualitative assessments. They're harder to define and sometimes it takes longer, right? But you can get there through team member testimonials and interviews. You can be part of case studies surrounding the DEIBJ programs. You can do, again, surveys. And then you can talk with, like Ken said earlier, the people in the community that are being impacted and finding out how that's working. And you can do that through third-party audits. and they provide a more objective assessment of organizations' performance in these areas. Another thing that you could consider is benchmarking. I think one of the panelists mentioned it earlier. We have to not be afraid of where we're starting and where we're trying to get to, and recording the steps as we go forward so that we can share that information with other foundations. Ken also mentioned the community again, and I think getting feedback consistently from them is key. And you can do this by regular check-ins and updates, and provide the questions so that people don't feel intimidated by having these meetings. I think those are the things that I can think of. The one other thing that I would add is that again, that transparency in reporting, so that you can continue to move the ball down the court.
Yeah, and I think that's always important, right? To continue to move, to have a progress movement on this versus being stuck at a place. And since Illy kind of mentioned, Ken kind of provide insight, Ken, maybe you can share a little bit more about how have you kind of been measuring this the work that you're doing.
Sure. Well, I think we're familiar with, and Illy pointed out the quantitative and qualitative, framework and how we can measure that. We can do that internally, but what we kind of focus on too, in addition to the internal piece of it, we focus a lot on our grant recipients and how diverse they are, right? And what kind of proximate leadership they have in the space. We really hold value when we see organizations that have proximate leadership, right? When they have people who have lived experience for whatever the area is, that counts and carries a lot of weight for us. And then we also give a lot of strong feedback to organizations that don't center people with lived experience, right? Because we don't want to continue to repeat systems and structures that we're actually trying to dismantle. And, it's interesting because I just read a report, I think yesterday or the day before, that 75% of the executives that are in the D&I space are actually white people, right? Who have kind of like taken over the D&I space. And it's interesting because we have to remember the genesis of how D&I got to be in the first place, right? It's a derivative from the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which went into affirmative action. And then kind of when the affirmative action had some pushback in the 90s, now recently at the Supreme Court at the collegiate level, we had this, D&I emergence, right? And so, I went to a conference not too long ago where 4 of the people on the panel for a D&I discussion were all white executives. 80% of the audience that attended the panel were people of color. So there we saw a mirror or a model of systems and structure that have existed for at least 200 or 300 years in this country, right? And so how do we stop that from happening? So we're really big on proximate leadership and making sure representation is fair across the board. We also look at the success rates of the program and measure that, like organizations that have proximate leadership or people with lived experience and the programming that they're doing to foster that and advance their community. We measure some of those things, and we regularly track those things. We have a lot of engagement sessions with our not only stakeholders, but with our grant recipients to make sure that we are able to serve their needs and making sure that they're delivering on the things that they say they're going to deliver, in addition to the DE&I piece. So those are some of the kind of things that we measure, in addition to obviously the fundamental things that Illy mentioned so well.
Yeah, good. And I think that's been an area that, at least, in our work with Marisa Foundation, one of the things that we've been trying hard is to tell the story, right? It's a lot of storytelling on making sure everyone understands why we do something, the work that we do, but also what's the result and what's the impact and what is the continual journey of this as well. So I think being able to share the story and anecdote of that definitely helps others understand, but also being able to then share that story to kind of magnify the work as well has been impactful. Tanir, anything else to add in terms of just measurement, reporting, and accountability in this space?
Sure, just underscoring what Illy and Ken have already said. I think the only one we would add that I might add is we also ask a question just in terms of the super internal component. We do ask a question on our annual performance evaluations internally about personal contributions to racial equity and to creating an organization that models the how we want to show up in externally. And so every year we do hold every staff member accountable to their own personal racial equity contributions. So we do that internally as well. And we definitely started with the, with the quantitative stuff, that we've all talked about. It's really good and has some limitations, but we certainly measure the twofold dynamic of how many of our grants went to organizations that are led by people of color. And then we also measure, but how many dollars actually went to organizations led by people of color. We want to know both of those things. And then, as Illy pointed out, we're working on getting the qualitative data, and we are partnering with a firm to do long-term impact measurement to get that sort of bigger picture question of how are we fundamentally changing for us, the emergency response system in the state of California. How are we making an impact on that more global statewide response to people in emergencies and crisis with the racial equity lens? It's a harder place to start, but we're starting. You gotta jump in and start the conversation and wrestle with the challenges of how to measure it.
Can I double click on something that you just said?
Sure.
I love what you said about your partners and realizing that foundations, especially large ones, have a unique opportunity to open doors for people that have been boxed out historically. And I think maneuvering differently and offering seats at the table to different consultants or board members, or whatever way that you can bring that diverse perspective in is critical. So great point, Tanir.
Yeah. And I think it's an area that I have seen definitely even more companies is trying to create, tools that can help tracking, right? Tracking of data, tracking of a relationship of data, and being able to then help you tell the story. Because a lot of times, if you don't have the data, how do you go tell the story? So I think one of the things that I've seen is a lot of foundation have actually been providing funds to we want you to get data to help us understand this more, not just to do the work. So I think that's also a great way to kind of pivot on how the foundation can contribute to the work. So next question, and we kind of talked about all this data and tracking, is the sustainability of this work. How do we sustain this work? How do we make sure that it's continuing to be an integral part of the missions, the goals, and the programmatic aspects of it? I feel like this is definitely something that is critical, I think, so that it's not just a trend, not just a hot topic that we're all dealing with right now. And maybe Ken, any insight on how do you sustain this? How do you keep this top of mind?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's kind of a couple of different lenses to look at this through. You can choose to sustain it, otherwise it's going to sustain itself. And what I mean by that is that when you look at the public school system today, 54% of students in public school system are students of color. And so when you think about workforce, when you think about society, you think about community, the numbers tell the story for us of what's happening in this country. There's a seismic shift happening, right? Baby boomers are retiring. A lot of the older white population is aging out, and more diverse populations are coming in. This is the society of tomorrow that we need to plan for today. And so I think that if we don't take the necessary steps to sustain the work now, it's going to sustain itself anyway. We can't run from this, right? So what we need to do is be able to really understand that the future starts today, and implore leadership and convince leadership that we need to make the necessary changes in change management. We need to invest in the requisite leadership of tomorrow. And you do that by providing opportunities, not just space, but also learning and development opportunities and skill development, skill building, et cetera. Otherwise, we're going to be behind the 8 ball, not only in our philanthropic work, but also in our corporate structures and our corporate work. So I use the demographics a lot when I have these conversations with folks, and I tell the narrative and tell the story about, this is something that we can't avoid, shouldn't avoid. And if we're going to be in the forefront of innovation and thinking and thought leadership, that this is something we just have to do.
Yeah. And I think part of that is also, we are at that point in time where that's how we can tell the story. But as things evolve, how do we continue to make sure that we bring in the narrative and bring in the updates, right? So that then we can make sure everyone is staying on top of it as well. So, Tanir, your thoughts on sustainability and continuity of this work?
Sustainability is hard, I think. It just, even when you sort of frame the question, I was like, I felt a little tired just hearing it, because the work is a marathon, and that's just what it is. That's just what it is. And so I think, super practical from an operational perspective, just what we've been talking about throughout this whole hour. I would just name, make sure your policies are in place, and that will help to always sort of rely on those. I would say culture of the organization is just hugely important in terms of sustaining the work and just consistently hiring the folks that you want to really help perpetuate the culture that you idealize. I think those are two kind of just practical operational things. And then, just allowing yourself to realize that, again, it is a marathon, and, sometimes you just have to kind of forgive yourself. And one of the examples that we have at our organization is we really made a commitment to be a learning organization. So we try to do a lot of reading. And sometimes when it comes time to have our, book groups or book chats or whatever name we give that, folks haven't read the stuff we all wanted. It sounds really fun at the beginning of the year to be a learning organization. We want to read together and learn together. And then, when it comes time, everyone's like, oh, I'm too tired to read the book. And so you just have to kind of navigate through that and give people all the time they need. I encourage people to sometimes do that work during regular business hours where that may not have occurred to them before. But sustainability is it's tough. It's a hard one, and you just gotta pick yourself back up and keep going when it gets exhausting.
Yeah. And Ellie, and other thoughts on the work here? And since you've been involved in this work for a long time, your perspective and insights will be helpful. Yeah.
So I'll start by saying, ensuring that DEIBJ initiatives are sustainable and remain an integral part of the mission and the programs of an organization or a foundation. It's a multifaceted endeavor, and it requires committed leadership, continuous effort, and the active involvement of your invested parties. And some of the strategies that I've seen in my work with leaders and organizations and foundations at CEN, at ClimateWorks Foundation, and at California Life Sciences was the need to have, as they've said before, commitment of the leadership and executive buy-in and accountability. We've all talked about that at the top. We also have to have a strategic integration. We have to incorporate it we have to incorporate into the mission, vision, and values of who we are. It can't be a separate thing. I've seen this mistake. We make it separate, and then we say we're doing the work, but it's not injected into all that we do. So you have to have a strategic, intentional, I think like Ken said, integration of this that also includes your policies and procedures. It includes, like Tanir said, regular trainings that are not one-offs, but they're something that are part of the organization, and they are part of being a team member. So it's an expectation. There's not a surprise, and we don't deviate. Ken said something earlier, and it led me to remember a quote that I heard from someone. And the quote is, create a culture or create the culture that you want to have. Because if you don't, one might be created and you might not like it. So if you do the regular trainings and you do all of the things that we're talking about, you are taking an active role in creating what you want your DEIBJ efforts to be. Measurement and evaluation. We're foundations. We know about that. We have to have KPIs and metrics and continuous assessment. We want to make sure that we have transparency again and communication so that we can report and have ongoing dialogue. We want to make sure that we are investing in capacity building. Let me say it again. Foundations, we have to invest in capacity building for our staff and for the people that we are funding. I'm going to say it again. And for the people we are funding, we have to offer capacity building support. And then I think it's important to have future planning. You have to have the succession planning, and you have to be willing to scale. You have to be responsive, and you have to be willing to make mistakes. And I think by focusing on these various components, Foundation can work towards making DEIBJ ongoing and sustainable and an integral part of the mission, vision, values, and programs.
Yeah, well said, well said. And I think, I think so much resonates that a lot of it is not just setting it up, but it's sustaining, it's putting measures, policies, process, monitoring, and even infrastructure to make sure that it happens. You can't just go, yeah, make it happen, but you have no budgets, or you have to limit the budget and you have to go figure it out. So you have to invest to make it work. Otherwise, it's a failure from the get-go. So I think all those are definitely great advice and great things to think about as we continue to either jump into this or continue to sustain this one. So our next polling question essentially is, in kind of hearing all these great ideas, great suggestions and leading practices and thoughts about how we can do this, is what next steps do our audience here plan to take to embed and operationalize DEIBJ into your foundation mission and program? A, conducting an organization-wide assessment. B, establishing a dedicated committee or task force. C, allocate specific resources that, we've kind of talked about capacity building and budgeting and whatnot, to not only prepare, but also upskill our staff and board, because everyone needs to dig in. Or D, seeking partnership with communities and organizations, because if we don't partner with the communities and people that we truly are serving or working with, what's the impact there? So let's see. This is our final polling question. So for those who need CPE, make sure you get it submitted in. And once we kind of show this result, one of the things that we'll jump into is just I think all of you can stress out, this is not easy work. This is not, it is tiring work, and it is an ever-growing and ever-evolving work. So we'll jump right into some maybe encouragements and advice. So it's pretty split in the work that everyone plans to take in the next step. So, and I'm sure, if anyone needs suggestions or ideas from this, our panelists will be great resources to kind of tap on the shoulders to get some suggestion as well. As we kind of close this out, we only have a few more minutes left. Is one of the questions that I have for all panelists now. Any final advice or encouragement or suggestion for our audience here who is either stepping into or diving in that haven't been spoken? Something that you want our audience to take away as they go into the work. We'll start with Illy.
Okay, first I just want to mention that there are a lot of great questions in the chat. And while we did not cover them during this session, we will be very open to talking about them later on. And I do want to mention that eliminating affirmative action, what is my perspective? I don't like it. I'm just going to leave it right there. But all the other questions we'll be willing and happy to address later on. First off, I want to thank you for engaging in this conversation with us. It's critically important in that organizations and foundations embody DEIBJ. For some of you, I know it's a first time of you hearing about belonging and justice, but I'm a true believer that without belonging and justice, you can't have the D, the E, or the I. One of the things I'd love for you to take away, or another thing that I'd love for you to take away, is that don't be afraid to start the journey and don't run from your missteps. Apologize and continue to push forward. For centuries, for years and years and years, Black and Brown people have been pushing this work forward, and we need the help of everyone to bring it across the finish line. We talked about a variety of subjects from so many perspectives, from the challenges that the organizations faced and implementing DEIBJ initiatives to leading practices for sustainability and impact assessment. The road to achieving this is complex and ever-changing, and it requires a holistic approach with an unwavering commitment with all invested parties. The strategies and leading practices discussed here will offer a foundational roadmap for any organization or foundation committed to doing this meaningful work. And it's essential to remember that it's ongoing, that it's hard, and it requires consistent assessment, community engagement, and readiness to pivot or adapt or improve or acknowledge the complexity of the issues that we've discussed. I really appreciate being on this panel with such wonderful panelists, and it was a pleasure to serve. And if you want to stay in touch, please don't hesitate.
All right, Ken, final thoughts? I think Ken is frozen. Tanir, why don't you go?
Let me jump in, and Ken can follow me when he's unfrozen. Well, Illy said it beautifully. She captured everything I would have said. I'll use some of my own words to kind of underscore it. I would just say, if you are still in kind of pondering mode and just thinking about jumping in, I would give you a strong push to start now. Everyone has some power and brings it to the table, regardless of where you sit in the organization. Use that power and start working on racial equity. We are out of time, and the urgency is now. So please, I would encourage folks to stop thinking about it and jump in. You know, as Illy said, it's uncomfortable, it's messy, it's long, it's exhausting, it's imperfect, and doesn't matter. You just need to do it. And find partners in the room. They're out there and they're ready to work collaboratively with you. You just may not know where they are right now. But start today.
Yeah. I think I'm back.
Yes,
you are.
There was a glitch in the matrix. It's hard to follow these two brilliant folks here, but I will double click on something Illy said, which was it's multifaceted and understand it's multidimensional. So it's on us to actually learn what those dimensions and facets are, so that way we can rep them in the right way. I'll also talk about something that Tanir said, which is that it's a marathon, not a sprint. R.I.P. Nipsey Hussle, for those of you who don't know where it came from. It's a marathon, right? And so this is a protracted struggle. All struggles are protracted. So it's important for us to understand that and not think that we're going to get instant results. I would also say, like, fight like hell. Like we have to continue to fight like hell, and we have to be able to present not only the social case and the heart-centered case, but we also have to present the ROI case. There's a huge, huge return on investment. And oftentimes people that are responsible for some of the decision-making that we have to report to, they don't understand the business of the ROI case in the way that we do. So it's important for us to present that so that way they can see it Otherwise, we run short of having a myopic viewpoint or allowing them to have a myopic viewpoint. So I think a combination of all of those things is important for us. But I think at the end of the day, no one's coming to save us, and we got to keep pressing.
Yeah, well, all those are great advice and great encouragement because, and I'll just add one thing, one of the great things for me is just having a community, right? I've been fortunate to kind of meet all of you. Illy and Tanir and I were part of a Racial Equity Action Institute. I think part of it is just digging into the work, having the community to support you and lean on, to cry on. It's always super helpful. So I encourage all of you to be in community and leverage the work that we all have started and be launching pad from that. So I thank all the panelists. Thank you for your time today. Appreciate all of you with us here today. And I'll turn it back to Amy to kind of get us to the break.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for a really great discussion. That was a lot of valuable information packed into that session, so we really appreciate it. To our audience, we're going to take a 5-minute break and then regroup for our next session, which is Leading with Purpose, Essential Traits of Highly Effective Foundation Boards. Please keep your webcast console open and join us back here in 5 minutes. Thank you.
Hi, Ellie.
right, everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started again. I hope everyone enjoyed your short break and enjoyed that session that we just had, excuse me, on DEIBJ. For our next session, Leading with Purpose, Essential Traits of Highly Effective Foundation Boards, I would like to turn it over to Annie Rose Favreau, Moss Adams Senior Manager from our consulting group. Annie Rose.
Thanks so much, Wendy. LeeAnn and I are really looking forward to sharing more with you all about some of our experiences working with foundation boards, sort of what we've seen work well, where boards run into challenges, and really set out some practical strategies that hopefully you can walk away with today. So to introduce ourselves, I will kick us off. I'm Annie Rose Favreau. My pronouns are she, her. I'm Senior Manager with the Business Consulting Team. And I specialize in governance work, doing board facilitation and development, as well as organizational assessments and strategic planning. So I love coming in and getting to work with specifically nonprofit public sector leadership teams to be able to move an organization from point A to point B. So LeeAnn, want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Annie Rose. Hi, everyone. My name is LeeAnn Stivers. I'm also a Senior Manager here with Moss Adams. My pronouns are she, hers. I worked, prior to being a consultant, I worked in the nonprofit industry for almost 20 years, especially at an executive level. So I've been on both sides of the board, managing it and as a participant. I'm super excited to be here today. I also focus on strategic planning and transformations within organizations. So happy to be here.
So in terms of our agenda, we're going to go through a couple different pieces here, just starting out with defining what do we even mean by good governance? What does this look like? Looking at some common traits of highly effective boards that we've seen. And then we're going to zero in on effective meeting practices. And that's because so often the meeting is the primary place that boards are actually trying to get work done within. So we want to spend a little bit of time there. And then finally round out the discussion thinking about board development and some best practices. But our goal really for today is to share the best practices that we have seen out in the wild so that you can walk away with some practical ideas that you can put into practice, whether you are a board member or whether you are a member of staff that is actively working with your board. The work that your organizations do is so critical, and sometimes half the battle is just making sure that the board can kind of get out of its own way sometimes, but also really show up in its fullest and highest best use in support of the organization and its mission. So that's what we're going to go through today. But first things first, I actually think we have our first polling question. We wanted to learn a little bit more about all of you and who we have in our audience for this session today. So Amy, I will pass it over to you to get us started over there.
All right, so the first poll for this session is, what is your role in your foundation? And your options are A, board member, B, committee member, C, CEO, executive director, D, management, E, staff, or F, other or not applicable. And then just a reminder that we're starting a new session. So to receive credit, you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions that we pull up throughout this presentation.
And while those are rolling in, I was looking at this list and thinking, oftentimes when we get brought in to come help support boards, I feel like it most commonly is coming from either like the board chair, somebody who's on a governance committee, someone in that position, or it's coming from the executive director or senior management team member who goes, there's got to be a better way of doing this. I'm curious, LeeAnn, is that your similar experience? Have you had anything different in terms of sort of who you hear from first?
Yeah, it's that, and also, you know, an executive team or maybe a foundation that's just getting started in their efforts and trying to figure out how they want to structure it and set it up, and is still figuring out their executive management team. So yes, very similar. Eager to see who's in the crowd.
Great. So it looks like we have a lot at that management and staff level, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
So I really do think a lot of times this work, we can do a lot of that good managing up. How are we helping to support the boards that we work with as well? But nice to see we also have some board and committee members here too. All right, well then I'm going to move us forward into good governance. So what do we actually mean by governance? Sometimes when this word comes up, people think, okay, it's the board itself, it's our bylaws, it's our committees. But we like to think about it more as that holistic ecosystem. So governance is that combination of your policies and your systems and your structure and all of the pieces that are put into place to ensure that your leadership team can first make sound decisions that are in the best interest of the organization, and also take appropriate action to really forward the organization's mission in a way that is effective and accountable. So that's kind of the broadest definition of what we think about here. So again, it's not any one individual thing, which is part of what makes it complicated. It's really thinking about, okay, how do we set our board up to be effective? What is our holistic governance environment that we're working within as well, so that we're making sure our leadership team is really well prepared to provide guidance and oversight and direction to the organization. And a primary element of good governance is really thinking about, do we have clearly defined roles and responsibilities? And we wanted to start here primarily because this is, I would say, the number one area where we see boards really run into trouble is if they don't have a strong grasp of what are we supposed to be doing, and specifically, how is that different from the management team? A lot of people may have had experiences being part of an executive management team, but coming into the board is a different orientation as well. So at its core, we think about nonprofit boards in particular having these 4 core functions. The first is establishing the strategic framework. And by that, I mean things like the mission, the vision, the values, the ways in which you define what is the core purpose of our organization, and most specifically, what is our organization's place in our community and in the work that we are trying to move forward. The second core function is around direction. So this is kind of bringing that strategic framework one level down and thinking about how are we as a board establishing goals for the organization, monitoring against our operating plan, are we making sure that we are having progress in the right direction. This is also where developing policies and procedures really come strongly into place. These are all tools that the board is using to, again, set that direction. Third on the list is accountability. And this one's an interesting one because sometimes we come in and we'll have a board that they kind of say, get rid of all the rest of them, we're only here for accountability. It's really easy to kind of overemphasize this oversight function, but it's really critical. It is an absolutely essential piece of what a board is there to do. And when I think about accountability, there's a couple different directions that I think about here. The first is just how are we as board members holding each other accountable to acting in professional standards, acting in the best interest of the organization. We have a role as board members, have a role and accountability towards each other. Another aspect of that is accountability where the board is typically overseeing the executive director and holding that role, or the general management team accountable to making progress on the operational side. And then there's obviously also monitoring the financial and operational performance. That's a very significant core responsibility of any board. And then the last one we have on here is goodwill and support for the organization. This is another one that sometimes gets forgotten as part of this process, but really the board is there as the most sort of senior leadership team for the organization. And ideally they are the face and part of, when you're dealing with external parties, they're a really, really strong advocate for the organization in that space. They should be providing support and counsel to the executive director, but really thinking about this fundamental role of the board as positioning the organization within the community, within industry. That is so, so critical. Obviously, as terms of goodwill and support, sometimes that also comes with financial support in some way, shape, or form. But really the concept here is that the board is first and foremost a champion of the organization, and that's a critical part of their role there. So those are the high level pieces that we want to see, and we want to make sure that all boards have, and all board members have a really clear understanding of this is why we are here. We're not here to do operational work, we're not here to do the work of management, we're here to do these core functions. But jumping in even a little bit more deeply, one of the things that we noticed as LeeAnn and I were sort of talking through roles and responsibilities is that depending on the size of your board, you might also have some more specific responsibilities that come into play. And I'm saying small size board here, but I think this also is really applying to the maturity of your board. If you're a really new board, you're probably, if you're in early stages of development, you're probably not going to have a lot of capacity to focus on anything besides some of these really core functions that we have listed here. So for small size boards or for newer boards, some of the key roles and responsibilities that we want to make sure everyone is really clear about so that we can function well together. Things are like strategic planning. Again, setting those foundational, where are we trying to get to, where are our goals, all of those pieces that I discussed before. Ensuring baseline ethics and compliance with regulations, ethical standards is a big one. Oftentimes grant making, fundraising activities may be brought in here. Financial oversight is obviously a huge one, typically at least reviewing the annual budget and approving the budget, monitoring financial performance, ensuring proper financial controls are in place via policies and procedures, appropriate segregation of duties, that type of thing. So I won't go through every single one of them, but you get the sense here. These are sort of the core functions that we would expect all boards, all foundation boards to be engaged in. When you get one level up, either whether your board has grown or you're just maturing in terms of the board's growth, this is when you really start building in a lot of the infrastructure pieces. And so this is when board committees come into play. Do we have appropriate committees? Do we have clearly established charters for them so we know what each working group is meant to be focusing on, some of those pieces. This is also where you start thinking about board development. How are we training our board members? How are we onboarding our board members so that we have a good set of skills here? You can start thinking here about impact assessment, looking, this is when you can really start getting into looking at theory of change, looking at program evaluation pieces. This is when you can start really deepening the work that might be happening there and the oversight that the board is providing. And my favorite topic, risk management. This one often comes up again, sort of as you're maturing into a larger size board or a more mature board, you start thinking about what are all the risks that are out there and how we want to be thinking about them and monitoring them and mitigating them. And then finally, once you hit that sort of larger size or more mature board, that's when we start thinking of the responsibilities as kind of taking on this broader, more external facing role as well. This is when we start to think about industry leadership and strategic partnerships, advocacy work. This board development and succession planning becomes even more important at this phase as well, because you really want to make sure that you have continuity as you have changes on your board, which is natural and to be expected, but how are we actually growing our leadership team within so that when your board chair exits, you have a really good internal candidate who's also ready to step into that spot. So I know I spent a lot of time on roles and responsibilities, but it is one of the foundational pieces of if we are not clear here, you're going to run into so many issues further down the line. So this is one of the reasons why we encourage boards and why we see high functioning boards really spending a lot of time clarifying these things, whether it's through policies and procedures, onboarding practices, bylaws. There's plenty of different ways that this comes up, but it's well worth your time to be able to really dig into these. And one of the ways that this shows up is kind of the board sweet spot, because if you can get your roles and responsibilities really well defined, it's going to help keep you in that sweet spot here, where we don't want a board that is too in the weeds. I'm sure, especially knowing that we have a lot of folks on the staff and management side, I'm sure you may have had the experience of when a board member really, really wants to be part of the management team and get into the weeds and get into the operations, and that is not a good use of their time, right? If you have a board that's too in the weeds, it means that they don't have the strategic focus that they should be having and bringing to the table. It often gets into issues of micromanagement, which can cause tension, and it's just a really poor use of everybody's time. And just limited capacity for that big picture thinking that you want your board to be able to engage at. On the other hand, you might have had the experience where a board that you're part of or that you're working with is way too high up and they're completely disconnected. They don't have a good sense of what are the day-to-day operations even like? What are the staff concerns that are coming up? What's actually happening in the industry? And if you have a disconnected board like that, then really they'll have a lack of understanding of those organizational challenges that ideally you want your board to be tackling and looking at and saying, how are we going to address these and move forward? It's very difficult to provide appropriate oversight if there's not a good level of engagement here. And it's just a missed opportunity for actually providing the degree and of high quality strategic guidance that we want to see from the board. So all of those pieces are coming together here, where you want your board to be in the sweet spot, but how do you actually make that happen? Let's say your board is not in that sweet spot right now. That is a very common challenge. And I would say, again, going back, first and foremost, it's that roles and responsibilities. Sometimes the issue is that there's just a lack of knowledge about where should we be sitting as a board? How should we be operating? In a vacuum, a lot of smart people will make up a lot of fun and different and exciting things to be working on. And so sometimes if there is a vacuum, that's when you get into those tricky spots where the board is not really sitting in that sweet spot. However, we do have some other elements listed on this wheel that we have seen to help a board find its sweet spot. So I won't go through each one of these, but a couple that I want to point out. First, thinking about skills and expertise, providing training and ensuring that board members have the appropriate skill set that they need to engage in things like appropriate financial review and oversight. Sometimes you have a board that is not engaged enough because they just don't have some of the skill sets that are needed on that team. And so if that's the instance, really focusing on, okay, how do we develop those board skills, or how do we bring people onto the board that can help supplement? That can be a really great way of increasing the engagement there. Another one we have up here is ensuring that board members have a diversity of experience and background. This is really huge. If you can ensure that there is diversity on your board, obviously there's many, many benefits that come from that. But one of the issues is if you have a board that, for example, has very, very similar professional background, it's really easy to kind of get into group think. And it makes it that much more difficult to kind of come out if the board has sort of formed a rut. It's really difficult to say, okay, let's make a change, because everyone on the board says, but this is how we've always seen it done, and this is what we're comfortable with. So having diversity built in, this is one of many, many ways that it can help benefit the board, is by ensuring that you have different ideas that can come to the table and say, okay, this isn't working for us. What else have we seen work elsewhere? What else could we bring in here? I also want to point out engagement and commitment. Sometimes you haven't even told the board members, or sometimes they haven't heard it, even if it has been communicated to them. What is the actual commitment? Writing down, what is the job description for a board member? What do we actually expect when we say we want you to prepare for a meeting? Like literally, what does that look like? Sometimes spelling out those commitments can be really beneficial. And then the last one I will touch base on here is we have just strategic thinking up here. But one of the things I've noticed is that sometimes we'll hear, our board just isn't operating at that strategic level. We can't get them to engage in this way. But if you want your board to act at a strategic level, you need to be building in space and time for the board to be either asking or being asked to consider strategic questions and strategic issues and challenges. A lot of times we spend a good amount of board meetings just reporting out on things like financial and operational performance. And that's essential. You definitely need that to be in the meeting. But you also want to be making sure that there is actually space to say, how are we talking about strategic issues? How are we bringing these up? Do we have space where board members can be actively raising these? So sometimes it's as simple as creating space within your agenda to make sure that the board is actually being asked to engage with strategic planning or strategic topics within every time they come together as a team. So there's so much more that we could talk about there, but those are just a few of the ways that we've seen boards really try and pull in, say, how do we find our sweet spot together as we operate? So with that, I think we have hit our second polling question. So Amy, I'm going to turn it back over to you to take us through that one.
All right, yes, so the second polling question is, does your board tend to be A, in the weeds, B, up too high, C, in the sweet spot, or D, all over the place, depending on the topic? And then while you're responding to that, for those of you that would like a copy of today's slides and agenda, You can download them from the folder that says slide deck and handouts. And then we're also sending them via email after the conference, along with the recording of these sessions.
While we wait for some of these polling answers to come through, I will say in my experience at least, a lot of the boards that I work with like to be in the weeds. I would say that's probably the most common version of this. LeeAnn, what has been your experience there?
Same, always. They want to get in there, especially when you're getting to a more, like, the bigger the board is getting, the more subcommittees that are happening, things like that are engaging in that space. It starts to get them, you want them in those mission moments spots, but it can also lead to, well, what's going on over here? And I have questions about this. So yeah, I feel like that's the theme that I've experienced.
I think especially because a lot of boards start, if you're starting off as a really new board and you do need to be more of an operational board, that's really natural for early days, but then you want to make that transition, and sometimes that transition point is really challenging to you. So this is fascinating though. So this is actually the least on this one, which is great to see. It sounds like we have a lot of folks who are all over the place depending on topic. And I would say that that's pretty common too. Sometimes boards get really focused in on, you know, either you have a really high financial literacy board that really just wants to look at the financials or really just wants to look at program impact, what have you. So I feel like that definitely trends as well. But lovely to see that there's a good chunk of you that feels like you have a sweet spot board. That is absolutely fantastic too. All right, LeeAnn, do you want to take us through to our next section?
Absolutely. Sorry about that. Okay. So to intentionally lead with purpose and governance, you have to figure out what those highly effective habits are. So we want to talk about those with you all today. So in here I mentioned, you know, there are several that you can think through. I want to highlight a couple of them that I think would be worth a discussion. This is going to sync back to what we just chatted about with Annie Rose, but that thinking and acting strategically, again, syncing back to that sweet spot, but really figuring out how to call this out, right? What does this actually look like? Is this an exercise to talk about what those strategic questions are that you need them centered in based on their subject matter expertise that you want them to bring to the board? Is it a code word that you need to call out when it's not in the strategic space and needing to pull it back? So really focusing on that and maybe doing some analysis within your board to see when is that coming up and how can you either pull them back into that strategic space or creating an exercise to elevate some of those questions. The other one that I find really interesting on this list is that mastering small group decision-making. This isn't easy. This is one of those areas where, especially if you've got new dynamics within a board environment or a team, or they don't know each other well, this can get kind of challenging or trying to figure out how you can elevate voices. And so I really think, when I was supporting a board, thinking through an exercise around this on creating space on how much time to talk through a decision point, right? What does that look like with the team? Making sure you're elevating all those voices across the room. And then figuring out, are you ready to make a decision? And if everyone is in consensus, that's great. And then you can move towards that to get to the decision point. But if you're not, what's the barrier? What do you need to elevate to say, what information do we need? What do we need to come back to? What research do we need? So that you can get to that space of trying to find consensus across the group and it not just going into a lot of discussion points around it, because I know that can be a space, especially when doing group decision making. So kind of thinking through that piece. The other one that I really like on here is how to allocate board time and energy appropriately. So, most are, and these are volunteer positions that they're stepping into. And so thinking about how you want to engage your board members in a really intentional and authentic way. Are they leaning in? Do they have interest in the areas that they want to provide expertise in? And just thinking through, what energizes them as a board member. And I think that this helps not only in participation in the board environment, but also in retention and keeping them active as a board member. And then the last one that I wanted to elevate on here was regularly evaluating the board's performance. So this doesn't have to be super formal, although you can do that. And I would say as a very mature board, that is a best practice. But if you're just kind of getting used to this, think about doing it in a retreat environment so that there can be some conversation around what that looks like, doing some reflection time on the types of meetings that you're having, the cadence, whether that's monthly or quarterly, is that working, the agenda that you're working through, and then is it moving the needle for the organization? Again, bringing it back up to that strategic level and saying, are we achieving what we had hoped to? And if not, what do we want to course correct on or reflect on or make adjustments to refine how they're partnering together? But I really feel like bringing that performance conversation to the team is great. If you don't have flexibility or the time to create a retreat, I also think a survey environment will elevate those, maybe a reflection moments or opportunities and times so that, you can at least hear the feedback and then figure out how to work through those recommendations and next steps. So again, many habits in here that we wanted to call out, but just a couple to highlight and for you to consider. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the board and staff partnership. So based on our attendees here today, I'm sure many of you understand what this looks like or how it could look. But when I think about it and what I've had to establish over the years in partnerships, I really kind of think about the values of the partnership first, right? So that trust, building trust, that respect, understanding that this is our time and our exchange together, candor, really trying to be authentic in my communications. I like to tell the individual, my chair, or maybe going the other direction, the board members, sharing a little bit about themselves, that we're people and humans first, especially in the industries that we're in, and then focusing on those communications and that being bedrock to the relationship. And then I think there's just some best practices to consider in your partnership as a board and staff member. So regular check-ins with the executive and the chair, especially, open, consistent communication channels between really helps build a relationship and creates consistency in a space and a known time for connection to elevate if there are successes or new opportunities, time to just kind of talk through and brainstorm together. So I think it's a really valuable best practice. The other one that I love on here is the commitment to no surprises. I don't know about you, but nobody wants to receive information that could be not so great for the organization or a challenge that you're facing. Really trying to think through how you want to present that and making sure that that's not just on a whim, thinking through those communications and how between the relationship, especially at the exec level and the chair level, what are those expectations and what does that look like so that you're not in an environment of surprises. Nobody wants to see a news article about an organization they're working with, especially if you're on the board, and not have a heads up or something to that degree. So I think that's a really great best practice. Again, that strategic thinking, frequent communication, those expectations, but also thoughtful reflection on performance. One of the board's essential responsibilities is to evaluate the executive's performance. And so really thinking through and providing ongoing honest feedback about those successes or challenges, I think is really pivotal. Nobody wants that to come up at the end of the year on a review. You want that to be a known practice that you're working through in your relationship. And on the flip side of that, it's equally as important to do, again, those board assessments and really owning that performance. So again, going both directions in there. And then that allows the relationship to really strengthen and understand, where you guys are working from. Next slide is on board culture. So I like to kind of break this down into two categories, what I would consider formal board culture as well as informal culture. So let's talk a little bit about the formal aspect of this. So Andy Rose touched on some of these in her conversations, but really thinking about your form of governance again. So are you a governing board? Is this an executive board? Is it operational and working? What does it look like and how are you structuring that? And is that known? Is that culture known within the board member team as well as your staff on how they work together? Policies, so structure around the board's roles with the organizational policy development or approval, if that's a role or function that they have. Meeting procedures, again, just the basic outline of what this looks like and the exchange of information that needs to happen. Is it high level enough, not too in the weeds, staying in that space? And then onboarding practices and nominating procedures. So thinking through recruiting, what does that look like? How is the board going to be involved in that culture? Are they weighing in on interviews? What's that participation look like? As well as, bringing in new individuals. What does that actually look like so that they can be a part of the new culture of the board? And then I think about the informal side. So, this really focuses on relationship building. And so when you're thinking about how the board dynamics are working, how long certain people have been on, if there's newcomers, how are you going to create a space to create a culture of just welcomeness and maybe relationship building? I know that, we used to host kind of coffee chats that we would do in a virtual environment. We also set up, team building exercises at least twice a year where we could come together. But I think it's really critical for those board members to know each other. Again, in those working environments, they kind of need that baseline of relationships. Same goes for board and staff. Creating space and time for that connection, I think, is really valuable. Staff understanding what the roles of the board are, but also the culture of that team and how that works and their level of engagement. Communication styles and formality, that chair and the CEO expectations, again, back to that partnership, really understanding what those roles and responsibility piece look like and how that integrates into the board culture itself, I think is really critical. Control and access to information. In our digital world and our lovely email boxes, they are constantly ticking. So trying to figure out what's the right cadence of communication and information sharing. Is it all done through email, or can you consider collaboration spaces that can centralize some of that information? Again, especially in a volunteer environment of a board, they may have also a career and a family and other communication access points that they're also trying to manage. So thinking through how that culture of communication can simplify their role and the exchange of information that's happening. As well as that trust and candor, making sure you're building that out, conflict management too. So how do you manage when there's a challenge that's happening within the board culture environment? Is it if it's individual or if it's within team dynamics? How are you working through that, and how can you support each other in a team environment, or if it is on a more independent scale? So I think these are just kind of some important culture components to consider as you're thinking through your board development pieces. Creating an inclusive environment is crucial for effective governance and decision making. So we wanted to highlight, how much this really does make members feel valued and respected and have equal opportunity to share perspectives. I think there's some, core values that I mentioned in here: mutual respect, effective communication, or effective relationships and clear communication, expectations, and self-reflection. But I also think, when you look at this diagram, really thinking about people, how they're connecting norms and values. And so when I talk about people, let's think about, again, that board composition. Ensure that your board is composed of individuals from diverse backgrounds, including genders, ethnicities, age, their professional backgrounds. You want to make sure that you're valuing perspectives and insights. This definitely elevates your board opportunities and inclusion best practices. As well as developing norms and values. So we'll talk a little bit about this. I've got an example of this in our next section, but maybe facilitating an exercise on how the team wants to interact and what their values are. So you're really centered in what the team needs and what those expectations can look like. And being intentional about communications and team dynamics and relationships. I think hearing from individuals and what they need in those meeting spaces is a really great best practice. And then last, as it kind of wraps around all of these components, is that accountability and transparency. So holding board members accountable for creating and maintaining an inclusive environment. And that's not just about how you're onboarding, but if your organization has a diversity, equity, and inclusion best practice or policy or initiative, making sure that that is also bedrock to the board best practices and how they're interacting and supporting the organization's mission and values. You want to make sure that those mission opportunities or initiatives are also reflective of how you're operating in your board environment. Okay, so I think we're up, Amy, for our next polling question.
All right, thank you. So the third polling question is, how well do you think your current board is functioning? And then your options are very well, the board provides strong strategic direction, understands their role, and has a positive relationship with staff. B, okay, the board is functioning well, but is interested in making some improvements. C, not well, the board is either new or experiencing some significant changes. Or D, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And while you respond, oh, sorry about that. I do want to make the audience aware that we do have our final survey for this conference located in your handouts window. So if you could provide feedback for today's afternoon sessions, that would be appreciated.
Wonderful. I'm curious to see where people fall in this area, especially because so many were in this space of staying in the sweet spot. So I'm curious to know how they feel like it's operating and functioning.
Yeah, and while we're rounding that out, I see we have a question in the chat about our board culture is really need specific. How do we get board members to think more broadly about the needs, of the whole organization than being focused on what the foundation needs rather than what they need potentially as individual board members? And I'm curious, LeeAnn, if you have any initial thoughts or reactions to sort of how do we get that internal mindset to be a little bit more external?
Yeah. That's a great question. When I think about it, I think it's kind of hanging the hat of what the role of the board is intended to do, that strategic level. But I think where you have to also slice it out individually, and this is kind of where the art and science meets together when thinking about developing a board, is what are they interested in? I found that often when they're kind of getting stuck in the me space, they haven't been able to contribute on an area that they really wanted to focus on. So if you're at a space where you have committees, subcommittees that you've been able to break out, or you have outreach, community programming, any of that you can connect them more to the mission, I found that that's really helpful in that space. But also going back to those norms, and we'll talk about those more in the next section, really centering yourself around what are those roles and responsibilities and what that looks like moving forward. So that's my take. Annie Rose, anything from you?
Yeah, I would say having it explicitly documented in norms is so helpful, because especially then if you get in the middle of a discussion and everyone's just kind of withdrawn to their corners, you have something to point to that says, hey, remember when we had this discussion, remember when we said an important piece of what we're going to bring to the table is that sort of enterprise organization-wide mindset. And being able to kind of pull it back there, it can make it feel a little less personal and a little bit more just, we're reminding everybody what the group standards are as well.
Definitely. I'm so impressed with this group. They're performing well out there. 36% very well, 28% okay, 6% not well. Looks like there's some support. Hopefully this presentation elevates maybe some tools for you. And then I'm not sure. And I would say if you are at a staff level within the organization, especially, that's an okay space to be in too, but that might be something to share with your executive team about how can I learn more about what type of board I have or what's the governance structure so that you can understand those inner workings. And we'll also talk a little bit about in the next moment, some mission moments too, on how to connect if you're not sure what those dynamics are looking like on your board. But thank you all for participating in that. I'm going to go ahead and get us started on our next section, which is called Effective Meetings. So again, when Annie Rose and I were putting this presentation together, I was looking at this list and I was like, man, this, it seems a little basic. Is this okay? But, the more and more that I think about it, this is going to feel like, yes, I know this, but the practice of this is where it really, the rubber meets the road, so to speak. So what I would encourage you to do is, as we go through this list, take it back to your current agendas. If you're, in an executive role, especially, or a chair role, and is it meeting these marks? Or is there any refinement that you could do in these areas? It sounds like you guys are operating well in these, in your board environments, but maybe some of these logistics you could bring forward to elevate them even further. So let's talk about some of these. So again, setting clear objectives and agenda. We're going to go through what that can look like. I think the start and end time, I know, again, that's one that seems very basic, but I can't tell you how many board meetings I've been in where it's like 8 o'clock is hitting the marker and I'm done for the day. I've been at work all day and in an evening meeting, and really respecting that time, I think, is really valuable. So thinking through those pieces, fostering that participation and communication, really making sure that you're hearing all voices, and that it's not just centralized to the individuals that love to contribute in the space. This one I really love is mission moments. I don't know if you've had the opportunity to do this with your boards, but really connecting them to the foundation's work that you're doing, and being able to elevate, whether that's from the philanthropic side of things, if that's from an outreach perspective, if that's bringing in the program components that you can do. I really feel like this is also an opportunity for the board to connect. So back to that space of they're thinking about just me, get them back into the mission moment, get them into the weeds of what's happening out there and how the work is impacting your communities. I think it's a really critical space. The other thing that this does, especially if you're elevating staff members from different levels or even community partners, it gives them a professional development space. Doing a presentation to a board, maybe they've never had that opportunity. And so it can kind of work on both ends to really be able to elevate the meeting and get it started off on a great foot. Establishing meeting agreements. We'll talk more about use of technology. We've all been there. We know how painful that can be when it isn't going the way that we wanted to. The roles and responsibilities piece. The follow-up on action items is one that I do want to call attention to. This often can get missed at the end of a meeting, and if you don't have a great recap going out in notes with accountability, that can hurt your timeframes, especially if you're not meeting on, if you're only meeting quarterly, that can really hurt things. So making sure that that's bedrock to your agenda, evaluate and approve, and of course, maintaining confidentiality. So I wanted to provide some samples of, you can call it a meeting agreement, you can call it norms, whatever's the right word for you, so that you could take that back if you wanted it as a jumping point. There's a couple on here that I would call attention to is, figuring out especially if you're in a hybrid environment, which we'll talk about, but limiting the multitasking. I've seen that happen quite a bit, especially in virtual spaces, thinking through that. Staying on topic or creating that parking lot of issues so that you have space to say, okay, yes, this is important, but we don't have this on the agenda. Let's put this over here and then prioritize where it lives on our future agendas, I think is a really valuable meeting practice and agreement to think through. Understanding your inclusivity language and what that looks like and making sure that you're respecting that across the room. Assuming positive intent. Everyone is in that space to be very mission driven. So making sure that everyone's centered in that, especially if there's disagreement in the room. And then the other one is leaving it open if you are going to elevate your meeting agreements in each session is what else does the group need for the day? We all have lives behind the scenes. Where are they in that moment? And is there something else that they need during that meeting environment that's going to help them either stay active? Is it breaks? Is it standing? Trying to kind of figure out how to center them in each meeting so that you're being intentional about that. Next up is hybrid meeting considerations. This gets a little bit tricky. So I elevate it because I think we've all been in an environment where there's a group happening in person and then we're on the phone, and that translation of information or even noise and not really being able to understand what's happening in the room can be kind of challenging. And so if you are setting this up in this way, which I know many meetings are, kind of think through some of these pieces on here, of course, testing your technology, but consider your audio and video, perspectives. Is that synced up to the speaker? Can they actively participate? If you can, limit the side talks, especially when there's microphones in the ceilings in some of those rooms or around, that really picks up and can be really distracting. Many of our, the Teams and Zooms have breakout sessions. Use those, figure out how to really, equalize participants' ability to be active in the meeting. I think that can really help with engagement. I know we all can't be all the places all the time, and having virtual opportunities is amazing. I know I can greatly appreciate it, but really centering yourself around what does that mean from an engagement perspective, and how can you lean in and really make those accommodations ahead of schedule so that interaction is there for everyone participating. The other thing that we wanted to give you as a takeaway was a meeting outline example. I'm sure many of you have this and kind of have it outlined, but we thought it would be helpful to kind of go through, especially if you have never been in a board structured environment, what it is that you're going through or some of the high level pieces that you might want to consider adding. So typically an agenda is led with a call to order. This is a great space to welcome any new board members with those introductions. This is definitely where I would enter those mission moments, or if you need an icebreaker in there for the room to get to know each other. It's a great start to the session to really engage everybody. And then typically approval of meeting minutes is in here. A chair's report, so this can be updates from your board chair or recognition of achievements or milestones or new initiative work. Then it typically can go to the executive director or CEO report. So this is really focusing on foundation activities, programs, initiative updates that you want to highlight. Also the financial report or budget updates. If you have a CFO, they can also join for that discussion. And if you can have a dashboard to report on these areas for consistency purposes, I know that that can be really helpful. If you are in a space where you have subcommittees, this could be a great space to insert the committee reports. And so this can be examples of committees are, finance and governments. You may have a philanthropy or a program committee that might be doing work. And so this is a space to elevate voices. If you have board leads that are helping support those committee reports, give them some space in the agenda to kind of lead those discussions. And then any call to action items that they're needing from the board to engage in that committee work. So the other thing to think about, I know this, again, this may seem like, well, yeah, we need a break, but sometimes board sessions can be quite long. I mean, I've been in meetings where they can be up to 4 hours. So really thinking about, do we need a break? Do we need to just take a minute and cut this schedule or agenda in half and give everyone a second? And then coming back and talking through those strategic goals. So how are you working towards your progress and from a board strategic level? And what's needed across the group. And then, of course, discussing any new initiatives. That might be new funding that's coming in, or just changes and shifts in the dynamics of your mission, as well as board development and governance. This is a great space to update on recruiting efforts or onboarding, or any best practices that you're developing in these areas to kind of vet with the team. As well as policy development procedures and any other governance matters you need to cover. And then I think it's great to close with an open forum to allow for sharing of events, additional topics. This is also a really good space for your board members to share from their professional backgrounds, things that are going on for them to network with one another. So always allowing that as an opportunity can allow for that outside kind of team building time. And then, of course, saving space for recapping of those action items, owners, and deadlines. This is one that often gets pushed and the timeline hits and then it doesn't happen. So again, if that's the space that you find yourself in, making sure that you're really clear about how to recap those so that you're setting yourself for success with next steps. Okay. I'll turn it back over to you, Amy.
All right, thank you. So the last poll for this session is, what aspect of your board meetings need the most improvement? And your options are A, agenda development, B, meeting norms, C, keeping meeting participants on task and engaged, D, meeting length, or E, dealing with technology and hybrid considerations. And then also, we have received quite a few questions regarding your CPE certificates. So I wanted to let you know that we will compile those and send them out within the next few weeks. So please keep an eye out for that email.
Great. Curious to know where the team comes in on this one. Mine's always been meeting norms and staying centered to those and making sure that it's consistent with an ever-changing board with some of my experiences. What about you, Annie Rose?
Yeah, I've often seen we create beautiful meeting norms, but then if no one feels really confident to actually evoke those meeting norms in moments of potential stress or tension or challenge, it's really kind of, how do we get in the habit of actually exercising that muscle? I feel like that comes up a lot.
Agreed.
I think too, keeping meeting participants engaged can often come up. It looks like potentially that is a key topic that's coming up for some folks here too. And I feel like so often, I had a colleague who'd always ask, what's the WIFM? And WIFM for her stood, what's in it for me? But really bringing it back to like, why are you sharing this information with me as a board member? What do you expect from me in this moment? Is this just an informational item? Do you need a decision? Do you need engagement? Like really, really clarifying, what do we expect from people? Because I think we often assume that that information is being shared, and often it is very implicit. It is not necessarily explicit. So I'm curious what you've seen there too.
Yeah, agreed, for sure. Well, and I think, again, back to the engagement, it's when I kind of go back to, what are we trying to accomplish? Is this agenda meaningful? Are people engaged? How can we give other ownership across rather than, again, that report out? That environment gets very, very stale, especially, again, if you're in a virtual environment. It's really hard for people not to just pull aside and start working on other things. So thinking through how you want to elevate that and how you want to spend some time, maybe even activity-based. If you're not having the mission moment, what is something that you're constantly working on as a board to create space for engagement and conversation versus the constant, I'm just reporting out, I'm just reporting out. I think that exchange, we all want that, right? We're in meetings when you just don't want to sit there and you want to participate. So I think leveraging that and talking to your board about what they need in that space, because they'll have those answers. They'll help you along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a really big fan, if you are in person, of doing sticky dot exercises. They're silly, we've all done them before, but there's something about the activity of having to get up out of a chair, to move around, to put something on a wall, to write something down, like giving tactical kinetic things for people to do, I also think can be helpful if your board's really used to not having that as an option, that you just come in and sit around a table together. I feel like that can sometimes just spark a little bit of shift and change and energy in the room too. Okay, so then I'm going to round us out here. I know we have a little less than 10 minutes left, so I'm going to focus on developing board skills as our final topic for today, because high-functioning boards invest in developing their members for sure. And so when we think about sort of common ongoing education topics that I'm seeing really frequently in terms of what's coming up for a lot of the boards that I'm working with, we have this list here, and some of these I think are total perennials, roles and responsibilities, fiduciary responsibilities. Those are always going to be on the list. But there's a couple on here too that I think it's worth calling out, because they're really areas where you can benefit from ensuring that your full board is speaking the same language and has the same framework to tackle some of these topics. So the first one there is risk management. This is really frequently an area that, depending on what industry your board members are coming in from, what their background is, they might have a really clear sense of what they think risk management means, but what does that mean within the foundation setting? And are we on the same page around that? Do we have a clear sense of our organization's risk appetite? Do we have a clear sense of even how we are identifying and tracking risks? This can be a really, really great one where you might think that you're all saying the same words, but this can really benefit a board of having some consistent development in that space to make sure everyone really is on the same page. I would say that's true as well. We have ESG listed here, meaning environmental, social, and governance reporting. This is a framework. You may already be very familiar with this. I would say this is coming into foundations in many different ways. Obviously, foundations from day one have been dealing with how do we manage our impacts in terms of environmental, social, governance impacts. It's not like that is a new concept, but that framework in particular, especially as it's coming out of publicly traded companies and investment, that's really the sort of impetus behind what created that framework. So that's another one where it can be beneficial to get everybody on the same page. And then as the last session so eloquently was pointing out, diversity, equity, and inclusion, or the acronym or the language that you use to talk about equity work, this is a really, really major area that we're seeing boards invest in, because you need to make sure that your board members, especially if equity is a core central function of your foundation, making sure that your board is really well versed in understanding how does this show up in our work and how do we need it and how do we need to show up as individuals to forward that work as well. The other piece I wanted to highlight here, and LeeAnn touched on this a little bit earlier, but decision-making capacity. This often we don't think about this question of how well do we make decisions together. We don't always conceptualize this as a distinct skill set, but it really is. If your board is spending a ton of time discussing topics, especially not that important topics, or want oodles of information from your staff but don't do anything with it, or get into arguments, or can't resolve conflicts, all of that points to the idea that building decision-making capacity is a muscle that the team could use to strengthen. And so this can be one helpful way of just framing it out for your board. Again, this is a very not personalized way of talking about it, in a good way of saying, okay, as a team, we need to figure out how do we make decisions together, and what tools do we need? Do we need a decision-making framework? Do we need different information? Do we just need more clarity? What does that look like? Another topic, a tool that LeeAnn referenced earlier, is an annual board self-evaluation. This is one of my all-time favorite tools. It's basically, you go through a questionnaire with your board together, you assess performance at least every 2 years. I like to do it every year, but it gives every individual board member an opportunity to reflect and say, how well do I think that we're doing as a group? Are there things that we need to work on together to move forward? And so it can be really helpful, especially if you don't have consensus on your board about what the actual issues might be. This can be a really great one. The other one is, if you already have a really high functioning board, the annual self-assessment can be a really critical space as well, because it allows you to say, okay, how are we going to take it to that next level? The other piece that I wanted to mention here, just very briefly, onboarding new members. If you don't invest in onboarding, you will spend more time later on down the road trying to catch up your new board members. Onboarding and having a holistic onboarding process is a really critical way of making your board accessible to new members. I think that's a really helpful way of thinking about the importance there. So this is a list of typical things that we see as part of onboarding processes. The things that I'll highlight on here in particular, I would say board buddies. Having a new member matched up with a more senior member is really, really useful, especially if you have if you're using Robert's Rules of Orders, if you have some very, very specific structural pieces built into your work, that can be incredibly alienating to people who may not have served on the foundation board before, or just not served in this type of space. And so having that board buddy, that is my sort of primary thing that I would say that's really, really helpful to make sure that your new board members have someone to go to where they feel really well supported. And then in our very last minute here, I've saved the best for last, but don't forget the fun part of this. People join boards for so many different reasons, and it's almost never because they just want to look at your financial statements for hours at a time, right? They're here to make connections. They're here because they care about your mission. So thinking through how can we sort of tap into the many different reasons why people may be volunteering to do this work and meet them there and really support that need. So whether that's providing volunteer opportunities, those mission moments that LeeAnn was referencing earlier, giving opportunities to socialize, making sure that there's a good sense of how is the board meant to connect with other folks out in the community. All of these things are really critical when it comes to keeping people engaged, excited in this work, and really tapping into some of those deeper reasons why people show up and want to be engaged in this work as well. So with that, I know that we have run out of time to address questions. I know that some really great ones came through in the chat, and seeing one here about Family Foundations, board makeup, and some other items here. So we will do our best to follow up with folks after the session. I know that we've run out of time. So with that, I will hand it back over to Amy.
All right. Well, thank you both for a great presentation. We really appreciate it. And to our audience, we are going to take a 5-minute break and then regroup for our final session. Please keep your webcast console open and join us back here in 5 minutes. Thank you.
All right. All right, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our final session, our Ask the Experts panel. Just wanted to give you a little background on the approach that we're taking. We did ask during registration if you had any questions that you'd like to have answered during our conference. So we're going to prioritize with those questions first, just because people took the time to put those questions into their registration, and we appreciate that. We also have questions that we weren't able to get to today, either from the morning sessions or some of the afternoon sessions. So we'll try to get to some of those as well. And then finally, if you have questions that you haven't answered, you can use the Q&A function in the chat. And if we can get to those during this session, which is only an hour, we will. Otherwise, we will be following up as best we can on all questions that are asked that we aren't able to get to either during the sessions or during this last session after the conference. All right, with that, I want to first just give you a recap of our panelists. Most of these faces you've seen earlier today if you've been part of our conference this morning and earlier this afternoon, but I did want to just quickly highlight who we have on the panel. I will be moderating the panel. Maggie Elliott is a senior manager. She was on our 990 PF session this morning, as well as Marisa Meltebeke. Jennifer Price is a partner in our audit practice. She has not been part of the session, so I wanted to make sure and recognize her. Colleen Rozillis is a partner in our consulting group. Also, this is the first time you've seen her face today. And then Kinman Tong, earlier this afternoon, led the panel discussion on DEIBJ, and we're happy to have him as part of our panel for Ask the Experts as well. With that, we're going to get right into our first polling question, so I will turn it over to Amy.
All right, thank you, Wendy. So the first polling question of our last session is, a private foundation client lets you know that they are going to purchase a building. What issues or questions as their legal, tax, and accounting advisors are important to discuss? And your options are A, utilizing an LLC for purchase and title of the building. B, use of the building and accounting and tax implications. C, balance sheet classifications of the asset and associated revenue and expense activity. Or D, all of the above. And then make sure to click the button next to the answer you choose and hit the submit button so that it registers. And if at any point they're not showing up for you, just hit F5 to refresh your console. We'll do 5 more seconds here. All right, here are the results.
Thank you, Amy. All right, so 81%, all of the above, and that is correct. You need to consider all of those items in the 3 above. So with that, let's discuss that question, because I know we get it a lot from our private foundation clients, and we've gotten it a lot over the last number of years, as long as I can remember. Marisa, I'd be interested to hear from you, because we do often get the question as CPAs, well, should we put this in a wholly owned LLC? And most of the time that is what we see for real estate, but it would be nice to hear the legal perspective of why that makes sense and what your thoughts are on that when a private foundation is going to purchase real estate.
Sure. So you do see single member LLCs frequently used for real estate purchases. And I think it's important to understand what a single member LLC provides and what it doesn't provide. So a single member LLC, it's a lot of private foundations are going to be corporations. An LLC is a limited liability company. It's another type of state law entity. It's created by filing articles or a certificate, depending on the jurisdiction, with the Secretary of State's office. And what's kind of slick about a single member LLC is it's a separate legal entity for state law purposes. It's going to have its own name. It can open its own bank account. It can enter into its own contracts. So it's a separate legal person for all of those purposes. But its default classification for federal income tax purposes is to be a disregarded entity. And so what that means is that the IRS doesn't view the LLC as being anything. So the LLC is automatically covered by a 501c3 member's 501c3 status for federal income tax purposes. So what that means is a private foundation could form a single member LLC. The LLCs, all of the LLCs like income, expenses, revenues, activities are going to be reported by the private foundation on the 990 PF because the LLC doesn't exist for tax purposes as far as the IRS is concerned. But you've created a separate entity that can have a separate governance structure. It can be member managed by the sole member. It can be manager managed by an individual. And what a LLC provides that most people are going for in this context is a liability shield. As a general matter, the member of an LLC isn't liable for the obligations of the LLC. So you'll see it a lot maybe with like, there's purchasing a building, but like if a donor was going to give you real estate, there could be liabilities on the real estate. Sometimes you can't suss all those out in advance. And so the goal of putting something into an LLC is to shield the member, here the private foundation, from the possible liabilities. A few things to note. Because the LLC is disregarded for tax purposes, you can't do anything in an LLC that the member can't do itself. I think sometimes it's easy to think of it as a subsidiary and be like, oh, well, the sub can do it because it's an LLC. Everything is attributable to the private foundation for income tax purposes. So the LLC can't do things that are inconsistent with the member's tax status. And another thing to realize is the disregarded nature of the LLC is for federal income tax purposes. So the LLC, again, it's all going to be reported on the 990 PF. The donor could make a contribution to the LLC, and that would be deductible in the same manner as a gift to the member. But not all taxes disregard an LLC. I'm based in Portland, and for the most part, you're going to be fine. The Oregon corporate activities tax disregards the LLC. We have a specific property tax provision that treats an LLC for property tax purposes in the same manner as the members. There's state and local taxes here, the Portland and Multnomah County, and similarly, they disregard the LLC. But just important to realize that being disregarded for federal income tax purposes doesn't mean it's disregarded for every other possible tax purposes. So sometimes if you put something in an LLC, make sure to check with the jurisdiction that like nonprofit corporate ownership isn't required for a property tax exemption, because sometimes you get bad results.
That's great. Thank you very much for that context and for reminding us of all the taxes that we have for those of us that are here in Oregon.
So many.
Jennifer, if you could speak to the accounting considerations, I think that oftentimes when our clients reach out, that's the question they're asking is, what do we need to, how do we book this? What are the accounting considerations? Even though we know it is broader, but I think if you could speak to that, that would be helpful.
Yes, and this is a great question, Wendy. As you said, we do have many clients that have done this or are already doing this, and many are asking us every day about this situation. So for accounting and financial statement reporting purposes, because it is a wholly owned LLC, it does get consolidated for financial statement purposes. So it's consolidated in the GAAP financial statements, so it's basically treated as one entity in the financial statements. Typically, if it's just the building and the LLC and not much more activity, like there's not a separate operation in the building that's part of it, if it's just the building, sort of for that situation we discussed where it's just legally separating, most of our clients keep it in the same general ledger as the foundation. They keep it in the same trial balance as part of the foundation. Most do not create a separate general ledger or trial balance for this. Of course you can, it's perfectly fine to do that. We do usually advise our clients that it's good practice if they are going to keep it in the same trial balance to at least have separate account numbers or designations, just so you can always tell what is in the LLC, what are the activities related to that entity, especially if there's going to be more activity down the road or additional LLCs down the road. We have had clients
do one, and it's just one building depreciation expense. So it's easy to know what it is. But if you start adding more, it can get harder to track and remember. So we do always advise to at least have a designation. Maybe it's the last 2 digits of the account number, designate that it's part of this LLC. We have one client who's continued to add more and more and just set it up so that every number is a different LLC, and it's easy to just run what is the activity in that entity. As for reporting, so remember, because it's consolidated, it's one entity, the GAAP audit report would be updated to say consolidated throughout. There would be a description usually in the first footnote, describing the LLC, what its purpose is, and noting that all intercompany transactions have been eliminated. So if there were any transactions technically between those entities, they would be eliminated. And thereafter, it's just referred to as the foundation, as one entity. We do have a couple of clients who have added a supplemental schedule to the back of their financial statements to have separate columns for the foundation and the LLC to be able to see that activity and see the combined total that rolls forward. I will say that's less and less common. Most of our clients have gone away from that. And really it just depends, what do the users of your financials want to see? There's no requirement to show that separate activity in a supplemental schedule. But if it is of value to the board or other users of the financial statements, if you do start having more activity running through an LLC, it might be a nice option. But again, I would say most of our clients don't do that. It's very much just the foundation. So when you're thinking about classification on the balance sheet and the statement of activities, you're typically going to have, let's say it's just a building, nothing else. It's just going to be part of the foundation's building. So wherever the foundation classifies such assets, it's going to follow suit. So it's part of buildings. The related depreciation expense rolls into the foundation's depreciation expense. So really, all things considered, it is just one entity. Again, it is a separate legal entity, but for GAAP reporting, it's all one entity. So typically, even though it's mentioned, you really don't see a lot of places it's mentioned throughout the financials, other typically than note 1.
Great, thank you. And Maggie, if you could speak to the tax considerations for a private foundation, I think that would be helpful as well.
Sure. So from the tax perspective, I think typically when our clients approach us and they're considering buying a building, or maybe they just bought a building, my first question is, did you consult an attorney? I think getting all those documents, putting it in a single member LLC from a legal perspective does give you protection. So we typically like to start with that, but then really try to understand what this building is going to be used for. Is this going to be used for the foundation to host the staff and just normal day-to-day operations, i.e. totally exempt activity? Then it does get removed for purposes of fair market value calculation because it would be charitable use asset. If it wasn't, if let's say the foundation decides that they will use most of the building but also want to offer space to others, then we get into more detailed conversations because it may trigger some of that portion to be then recaptured for purposes of fair market value calculation. If it's not 100% used for charitable purposes, it also starts, generating questions about possible unrelated business income. So there's a little bit more due diligence. And so it's important to have those conversations and really, understand how the building is used, what's the plan, and how to best execute that plan. And I think from the state perspective, Marisa raised a very good point. We are fairly fortunate in Oregon, but if anyone from California is watching this, for example, California is a great example of single member LLCs having a filing annual requirement, regardless really of activity, and it's a gross receipts filing requirement, and there's an annual fee. So definitely before getting started, you would want to make sure that you're covered not only at the federal level, but that you've done your due diligence at the state level as well.
Great. Well, thank you. Our next polling question is coming up, so I'll turn it over to Amy real quick.
All right, thank you. So the second poll for this session is, what expenses can be included as investment or charitable? And your options are A, direct expenses related to generation of investment income, B, direct expenses related to grant making, C, allocation of accounting fees, D, allocation of salaries, or E, all of the above. And you will need to respond to at least 3 of the 4 polling questions that we pull up throughout this presentation to receive CPE credit. All right. We have quite a few responses. Make sure to hit submit before we close it out. And here are the results.
Great. 70%, all of the above, which is correct. Any of these could be, and we'll talk in our next panel discussion here about when that could be the case. And I want to just preface before I move forward any further, we did happen to get a lot of, I would say, more on the tax side in terms of questions. So not trying to exclude any of our panelists by any means, and I think we'll get to everything, but there are a number of questions that are very tax specific. So Marisa and Maggie, I also apologize to you that you're going to be put on the spot a number of times. So in terms of investment and charitable expenses, this is also a very common question and a common area of focus. And that's attributed also, or was reinforced with your session this morning on the 990 PF. But when can investment and charitable, when can expenses be deducted as investment or charitable, knowing that the charitable really drive your qualifying distributions towards the minimum distribution requirement for a private foundation? And I don't know, Marisa, you want to take that first from your perspective?
I can say a little bit, but I'll probably defer to Maggie.
Okay.
I find that, the questions I tend to get tend to be like, will this be a qualifying distribution? Private foundations have, this, roughly stated kind of a 5% annual distribution requirement. For some organizations, you're way over and maybe you don't have to watch it. But for others, if you're kind of, counting all your pennies to make sure you hit your minimum distribution requirement. There's a lot of questions about, can we count this as a qualifying distribution? And I think just one thing that I get that's just, I think there's sometimes some misunderstanding, private foundations tend to be grant makers. They don't have to be. So lots of, I think a typical model for a private foundation, it's one family's funded it and it's got, whatever pile of money it has, and then it makes grants out to public charities. And that is definitely one model for a private foundation, but it doesn't have to be that model. And so sometimes I get questions around, well, can the private foundation have its own programs? Like, could it hire staff to put on, educational programming? And it's like, yeah, absolutely, you can do that. So, you need to operate, in furtherance of your mission and of 501c3 purposes. But just because you're a private foundation doesn't mean you have to just be a grant maker. And I think that's sometimes something that there's a lot of confusion around, is like your direct charitable programming are also qualifying distributions. But the allocation of investment and those things, that's when I gladly defer to the accountants. You guys are much better at it.
Totally fair. And I think that's why really in the private foundation space, we've seen so much growth in PRIs, MRIs, right? That's like one way of really more in a business sense helping communities, but having that, if structured properly, of course, count towards your minimal distribution requirement needs. When I think about it, investment and charitable expenses, I think the investment piece is fairly straightforward to me. There's investment income and anything directly related to that from, management fees, for example, perspective, or any bank fees or transactional fees, any foreign taxes paid, that's a clear deduction. I think where it gets a little bit gray is, for example, salaries, right? And that's really highly dependent on the foundation, how it's structured, who's getting paid, what are they getting paid for? And so, like a director of finance, someone who spends a lot of their time on investments, I would envision that portion or majority of their allocation of salary could be investment related, whereas the rest would be charitable, since they're still working for the foundation and in a general sense following their mission. So salaries we often see split up, and we advise clients to really take a look internally to see what's appropriate, what's reasonable. No one expects individuals to track every minute of their time, but I think in general it's fairly easily identifiable who, a grants manager, for example, will spend mostly their time on grants and management of grants, i.e. charitable activities. And so that to me is clear that it's 100%. It's some of the other, especially executives, where I think some due diligence is needed to really assess how their time is spent and how can it be allocated. Accounting fees is the other common one. We obviously, when we prepare returns for clients, we work both on the 990PF, possibly the 990T. We do spend time analyzing investments. So we often see some sort of reasonable allocation of those fees as well. So that's really the two common ones where there's some kind of allocation. And again, I want to remind everybody that it not necessarily will look 50-50 or any other, percentage, because remember, for column B, if you're on an accrual basis, it would be your accrual expense, and for cash basis, it would be what you actually paid on cash basis and went out the door. So that's the other important piece of doing that accrual to cash. If you're an accrual taxpayer, to see what's actually the charitable portion.
Great, thank you, Maggie. And you made a really good point and pointed out briefly the 990T and unrelated business income. So this question was very specific, that was submitted as part of registration, but that missing piece from this discussion is it's possible some of those expenses could be allocated between investment, charitable, and unrelated business income, or investment and unrelated business income. Like you said, it's not always a 50-50, but it's also not always a split between these two categories that we have on this slide. All right, this will lead us into our next polling question.
All right, so the third polling question is, what are some important documents and points of data to review for potential grantees? A, financial ratios, B, financial statements, C, Form 990, or D, all of the above?
And I think while you're all answering the polls, I'll just chime in a little bit here before we get to our panelists on this discussion. I know there's a lot, and even Maggie, Jennifer, and I have participated in a panel about, trust-based philanthropy. And a lot of that discussion, it can lead to this exact question. And really, for some of your small grantees, it's hard for them to produce some of the documents, and they don't always have audited financial statements. And so I think that's becoming more of a trend, maybe at least with a private foundation's grant programs, maybe not all of their granting activities, but there could be specific areas. And I know during the pandemic, that was also a trend, was to try to get money out as quickly as possible, even if to smaller nonprofits, and trying to do that as streamlined as possible. So it'll be interesting to hear different perspectives on this, especially from Jennifer, our GAP accountant on the panel. And then Maggie and Marisa, you may have input on what's the bare minimum that they really need to ask for from a grantee, because we know on the tax side, there's there's very strict guidelines that have to be followed in terms of easier to give to public charities, but probably more documents or information that needs to be looked at if it's not a 501c3 public charity. So with that, polling results, 90% indicated all of the above. And I think in some cases that could be the case, depending on what type of organization you're granting to. I think what Jennifer may also give us insight to, or Marisa, is that also maybe if you're giving multi-year grants, or, there's probably different dynamics with grants where you need a written agreement and you may ask for some of these things. So with that, I will first let Jennifer chime in on this topic.
Thanks, Wendy. Yes, technically speaking, from an accounting, an audit, a GAAP perspective, there's no requirement of what has to be looked at, right? From an accounting standpoint, is it recorded properly in the right period? From an audit standpoint, is it authorized? Has it been reviewed? Is it following the organization's controls, policies, and procedures? So there's no requirement per se. It's mostly a legal and tax, I think, question that my colleagues will get to. But I will say, a lot of best practices we see. I think you touched on this, Wendy. It depends, always that fun answer. But when clients ask us this, or ask the audit site this, we would say, yes, it's good practice to obtain the financial statements from the organization, a summary of the project, intended use of the funds, and if there's a budget for the project, what is the budget? What are you asking for? If the entity does happen to have audits or even reviews, it would be good to get those financial statements and review those. It's good to confirm it's a 501c3 if that's the intended recipient. Of course, there's other situations where it's not, and I'm sure the tax and legal team will get into that. But beyond that, it might depend on what the grant is for, the size and magnitude of the grant. For example, Wendy, you touched on this, but we do have clients who issue some smaller operating grants, and they really want to streamline the process and make it efficient for their grantees to get the funds into their hands as soon as possible. So in this case, it may simply be filling out a form with their basic information, and nothing more is requested, and it's dispersed. There's no terms and conditions. This is an operating grant. It's trust-based philanthropy driven. Take the funds and use them. Now, for larger multi-year or even conditional grants, there could be much more involved, such as program milestones, especially if future payments are contingent on meeting those milestones. You could be asking for progress reports, budget to actual results, and we've even seen at times with larger multi-year grants, site visits or other in-person meetings where you're really looking, firsthand at the progress of the project or whatever the use is. So this always seems to be a balance of not adding a lot of administrative time on a grantee who may already be resource constrained, but also ensuring that the foundation is doing its due diligence, meeting expectations of the board, aligning with your mission, and being a good fiduciary with those funds, right? You're doing enough to feel good about granting funds to another organization. I'll also add, we always say it's best practice to have a signed grant agreement in place. So again, this may not be necessary if it's those small operating grants issued quickly to be used immediately, really no specific terms and conditions on the use. But for any larger grant, multi-year, anything where there's, terms and conditions, even basic, we would always prefer to see a grant agreement signed by both parties, just to have that kind of documentation when we're looking at the audited financials for those organizations.
Great. Marisa, do you want to chime in on thoughts from a legal perspective?
Sure. And I'm going to be echoing a lot of what Jennifer said. It's really a balance. So the legal framework varies depending on, is this a 501c3 public charity or not? And if the organization is identified on the IRS's database, so there's the IRS exempt organization search, or if you're savvy with the business master file of exempt orgs, as a private foundation, you could go to this publicly available database that the IRS maintains. You're entitled to rely on it for determining a grantee's tax status. And if they're a public charity, you can just write the check and you don't have a compliance issue. And then there's the question of, should you do more? And Wendy and Jennifer both mentioned trust-based philanthropy. This is kind of a movement that's gaining some traction as funders are realizing kind of this power imbalance that, they have the funds and the grantees are the ones on the ground, and the funders are in a position to potentially, put a lot of restrictions on the funds, impose a lot of, application process, impose a lot of reporting requirements. And kind of the idea with trust-based philanthropy is there's a great website that goes through this and has resources around legal constraints and trust-based philanthropy. But the idea is to have a more relationship-centered approach between grant makers and grantees, and to center a relationship and to try to strip away unnecessary process and kind of trust the grantees to be good stewards with the funds. But I will echo Jennifer that there's this balance, because from a legal compliance perspective, again, if it's a public charity, you could just write the check and walk away and that's it. Then the question will be, is that what you want to do? If you want some sort of reporting obligation, if you want to limit what the grantee is going to do with the funds, you're going to need to have an agreement in place that stipulates those requirements. Like, please only use it for a particular program. Please let me know how it goes. But even with that, kind of trust-based philanthropy principles can still be in play, even if you do enter into a grant agreement. So things like, instead of requiring a report, you could allow them to submit a report they've submitted to a different grant maker. Instead of saying you have to provide me reports, you can say, you have to respond to requests for information. So if you don't have any reason to be concerned about how they use the grant, but if you do, they have to respond. And so it's an interesting balancing act about, how much diligence should you do versus how much burden you're putting on the grantee. I think it's one of those things that people recognize that sometimes there's more process and red tape than we really need. As a lawyer and somebody that's usually risk averse, though, it's like hindsight's always going to be 20/20. And so some of the documents that were mentioned of wanting to review is, what if you just cut a check to a 501c3 public charity? You're in compliance from a tax perspective, but these things are public, right? Like the public can look at your 990 PF and see who you're funding. And so, if your grantee winds up in the news, or, like the executive director embezzled funds, or, all these like kind of parade of terribles. So it's really a balancing act of, what's your risk tolerance? How much do you know this grantee? And are there ways you can streamlining it with still protecting yourself? If you're giving grants to non-public charities, then you're in the expenditure responsibility regime. And that's, specific Treasury regulations that say, a private foundation can make a grant to a non-public charity, but only if it follows a certain process. Otherwise, the grant's considered a taxable expenditure. So if you're in expenditure responsibility, you have to do some amount of diligence on the grantee, enough to make sure that you can have reasonable assurances the grantee will use the funds for the charitable purpose that you've defined. You have to enter into a grant agreement that contains certain terms. I'd note that even though there's Treasury regulations that say, you have to have a grant agreement, it has to have these terms, it doesn't actually need to be a huge burdensome grant agreement. You can have a expenditure responsibility grant agreement that fits on the 2 pages. That it can be done. I've done it before. And then the grantee has to make reports to the private foundation on an annual basis until the funds are expended. And then the private foundation grant maker has to report the expenditure responsibility grant on its 990 PF. So what your obligation is as a grant maker really hinges on, is it a public charity or not? And I see we have this question in the chat, and I hope that answered it. The answer is, if you're giving a grant to a public charity, you don't have to require reports. It's a balancing act of, do you want to? And I think grant makers are starting to look at, like, is this a good use of grantees' resources to have to report back to them? But you are not technically required to have your public charity grantees report back to you.
Great. Thank you for that very robust information, Marisa. Maggie, did you have anything to add that wasn't already captured by Marisa on this topic?
I think I just want to echo what both Jennifer and Marisa said. I think, if you are issuing a grant to 501c3 organization, I think it's not hard to go on the IRS website just to confirm that they're in good standing, just so you know for sure and retain that in your records that they're 501c3. And that way you sort of shed many of the other cumbersome requirements. We often see this come up with, organizations that are new public charities that may have not gotten their IRS exemption. Those are some of the situations where you may want to do more due diligence or follow some kind of expenditure responsibility regime. But otherwise, I think both of them outlined all the requirements, and it always depends.
Great. Well, thank you. All right, we're on to our next polling question.
All right, so the last polling question of the conference is, can a private foundation conduct fundraising activities? And your options are yes, no, not sure, or it depends.
And I'll comment while everyone's answering the polls. I think we've got, so this may be, we've got one more question after this one that was submitted with registration. We split them up between yesterday and today's Ask the Experts panel. I know there's a number of questions in the Q&A currently, and if we've got some that weren't answered from earlier today, but if we can get to those, we can. And Marisa, thank you very much for tackling one of those already. Otherwise, like I said, we will follow up after the conference. We'll be accumulating those and follow up. All right, so it depends. Great, this is a great lead in to our next discussion. Marisa, how about you speak first to fundraising activities? Anything that a private foundation should think about, especially from a legal perspective, in terms of conducting fundraising activities?
Yeah, there's a few things. And I think there's often a lot of confusion in this space of, can other people donate to our private foundation? Again, the most typical private foundation fact pattern is it's usually tied to a specific family. A private foundation is a 501c3 organization. It's eligible to receive tax-deductible charitable contributions. So other people can give to your private foundation. There's kind of a question of will they? It feels a little different to give to something that might be kind of a family's specific philanthropy versus a more publicly engaged charity, but people are allowed to give money to a foundation. The foundation needs to issue a tax receipt, and it's deductible to the extent allowed. There are legal requirements that go around fundraising. So if you're, as a general matter, if an organization is soliciting funds from the public, most states have registration and filing obligations, and this can get gray pretty quickly. So like in Oregon, if you are fundraising, if you have an office here, you have employees here, they're asking the public for money, the charitable activities section of the Department of Justice is going to want you to register and file annual reports. That's pretty typical. In the internet age, it's a lot harder to decide, does that mean we have to register in every state if we have a Donate Now button on our website? And there's some principles on that of, are you targeting people in a specific state? Do you have a physical presence in that state? But there is some gray area here, but just know that fundraising is generally a regulated activity at a state level. Fundraising in different states often triggers filing obligations in that state. And kind of touching on something that was mentioned earlier about donor imposed restriction on assets. If you're going to fundraise for a particular purpose, if you're asking people please give us money so we can buy a building, and people respond to that solicitation, realize that you're supposed to track those funds and use it for that purpose. So yeah, that's a long way of saying yes, but don't forget all these other things.
Maggie, anything to add to that from a tax perspective that private foundations should be thinking about if they do fundraise?
Yeah, so we don't see it very often. I'll be very honest. I mean, it happens occasionally, but it is not, to Marisa's point, typically it's a family and linked family funding or some kind of other, large amount of funding that kicks off a private foundation, and then it just goes on without additional contributions. But it's not prohibited. It would not, what gets me back to the first question of investment in charitable fundraising would fit neither category. It's neither charitable nor is it investment. So that's a great example of something that likely wouldn't fit into either of those buckets. Otherwise, I think it just really depends. And I guess I don't see it often in practice. So it's an interesting concept, but I do know, to Marisa's point, from a state perspective, we work with a lot of public charities that, their staff spends a lot of time registering in understanding all the state rules, which that's really where from the charitable standpoint and donor standpoint, that's where donors get most protection. So I think it's important before you decide to, do an event or some kind of gala as a private foundation, that you consider all of that. And also it's important that those events are open to public, because, inviting your 10 closest friends for a fundraiser is probably not something that we would recommend.
Yes, very good point. And I did want to add, where I have seen it the most is with corporate foundations. So not as much in the family foundation, would completely agree, but corporate foundations, and in particular, maybe the corporation has hosted a golf tournament once a year and they've given the proceeds to charity, but they want to transfer that now that they've set up a private foundation. They want to transfer that activity into the foundation, or an annual gala, or maybe with that golf tournament, they also have a silent auction and they have a dinner fundraising. So there's multiple facets to the fundraising for the event. And I think that's also where we think about self-dealing. You just were alluding to it, Maggie, I think as well, in terms of, these are open to the general public. You're really trying the purpose of raising funds. The other area where I've seen it is also in the corporate foundations, but maybe they'll do payroll withholding. And so they've set up the corporate foundation. They're no longer really doing their philanthropy through the corporation, but now through the foundation, but the corporation will help funnel payroll deductions from employees' paychecks into the foundation. So, and with that, it's not a true fundraising activity, but it is getting contributions that are not just from a family or the corporation that founded the foundation.
One more thing that I wanted to add is also understanding the due diligence of then, doing acknowledgements for those donations. And so I think it's not as easy as it sounds, I guess, right. Is just my final comment.
Yes, that was a very, very great comment. You actually already led us into our next topic, and this is the last question that was pre-submitted with registration. Can we discuss a little bit, Maggie, maybe you can just start out and then Marisa can add to this, but state registrations, annual filings, or tax liabilities that a private foundation should think about when they have remote employees or multi-state activity.
Yeah, so we've been getting, as you can imagine, a lot of questions, particularly as related to employment, because with COVID, employees sort of spread across the country. It was, most organizations couldn't even, quite frankly, keep track of them. I know many of our clients have kind of firmed their rules in, we will only have employees in X state, or these two states, Oregon and Washington are common, especially up here in Portland. But the reason for that is all those registrations and annual filings can be very, very cumbersome. Each state is unfortunately different. Each state has different thresholds, different rules. And so that's just employment. So Then we're talking about fundraising that also is different types of state possible registrations and reporting. And then if you're invested in alternative investments, that adds another layer of, what may trigger nexus and as far as income in those states, but that also looks to see if you have property in those states, where are you operating? And so I think it just gets really, really complicated very fast. And the more involved your activity, the more broad your investment portfolio may be, especially alternatives. I think it really, especially with employment tax, I will say that's where the IRS is the strongest in making sure that everyone adheres to the rules. I think that it's important to analyze that and make sure that you're complying.
And Marisa, do you have anything to add for context?
Yeah, I'll echo what Maggie says. It's a really unsatisfying answer, because we've all, tasted the freedom that remote work can provide. And it's a real challenging regulatory regime for the employer to navigate. So Maggie's absolutely right. Like when your employee leaves, maybe wherever your principal place of business is, if they move across the country, chances are that the employment laws of the state in which your employee is working are going to apply, in addition to all of the employer-related tax and filing obligations. So your unemployment insurance, your workers' comp, and your kind of payroll withholdings. And then separate from, making sure you're in compliance from an employment perspective, then there's the question of, has that employee now created a place of business for you, the employer in that state? And as a charitable nonprofit corporation, on top of the employer-related filings, the other two likely filings that might get tripped up from your employees moving out of state are, do you need to qualify to do business in that state? So if you're, a Portland-based private foundation and you have some employees up and moved to California, now do you need to qualify with the California Secretary of State's office? And then a lot of states then, in addition to the Secretary of State's office, have a kind of charitable oversight department that usually sits with the Attorney General. So like in California, they have the Charitable Trust Registry. Here in Oregon, we have the Charitable Activities section of the Department of Justice. So having your employees go out of state then leads to these employment compliance questions, in addition to qualifying to do business and potential charitable oversight and regulation by other states' attorneys general.
Great. That sounds like it's really overwhelming. And I think one of the common themes that we hear from clients is we just don't know where our employees are. And so I think policies and procedures come into place too, in terms of a policy that you need to let employers know where you are working and if you do relocate. And I know even at Moss Adams, we've had to implement, we've had to develop that policy and really do our best to enforce it, but you are at the hands of your employees if you're allowing employees to work remotely. So, all right. I'd like to direct this question towards Colleen and Kinman primarily, but we may get other insight as well. But how have you seen foundations incorporating DEIBJ into their investment or grant-making strategies? And Kinman, I know you just hosted a panel earlier today, and that was fabulous. And I think there was a lot of great discussion, but maybe think about anything that wasn't talked about or ways that it's being incorporated that you see in our client base or with the Moss Adams Foundation, for example, that you'd like to mention as well.
Yeah, definitely a great question because it is something to consider, especially with like PRI's investments or grant making program that you're doing or considering. One of the things that, maybe I'll start with the Moss Adams Foundation. One of the things that Moss Adams Foundation has essentially kind of in aligning with our goal of being an anti-racist firm. Part of what we have looked at is offering up grants, what we call give back grant, that our employees can nominate not-for-profits to invest in or provide grants to. And this is something new that we have started doing this year, just so that we can include our team members in a lot of these DEIBJ efforts, right? Is investing in them to invest in this program so that we can all collectively give back and move the needle on this. So that's one thing that we have done. And then the other aspects of what we have done is the Modern Foundations have subcommittee that does evaluate not-for-profit that we want to give into to make sure that we provide impactful grants into addressing some of the key areas of sustainability, climate change, education, equity, as well as inclusion and anti-racist work, just because those are things that we stand for, and we want to make sure that we reflect that as well. And a lot of the foundations that we work with have started looking at aspects of this and embedding it into a lot of the works that they already do, right? Around education, around community involvement, around even healthcare access, especially with COVID. A lot of them have kind of taken this lens to just help educate their process better as well. So those are some things that we have seen. Colleen?
Yeah, I think you covered so much from the grant making perspective. I'm going to talk a little bit about investing because we see DEI as well as ESG aligned with investing in the foundation space. I mean, that's been around since the 1960s, right? We've had ethical investing for decades and decades. What's been kind of interesting in the last, I would say about 5 years, is along with that conversation that we were having earlier about that concept of kind of trust-based granting and more relationship-centered to really make a different type of impact in our communities. The same process can be taken with respect to investments. So thinking about what's our risk tolerance, what's really relevant to our mission, and then really evaluating that regularly because this is such a fast-moving space. I cannot state enough how that it's a really additional work if you want to really lean into DEI-based or impact-based investing. Because the space is so fast-moving, companies are constantly changing their missions. Things come up that we might not want our name associated with if we are going to go out and say that we're doing this type of investing. And so we really have to monitor, excuse me. And so one way to do that is to lean more heavily on your investment advisor. I've also seen quite a few foundations actually assign this role to a staff member. So thinking about someone who might straddle that line between finance and programs and be a place where they want to lean into this, but we have to have the capacity to be able to do that. And a lot of our clients have stopped kind of at that initial assessment phase and said, right now we don't have the ability to take this on our plates, but we're going to put it into our 3 to 5 year plan. I also want to note just the concept of impact investing. So not just kind of traditional investing in the stock market, but actually partnering with the public sector, with private entities to try to achieve something in a community. We're seeing that quite a bit, and that crosses a number of these spaces from the equity and diversity perspective, investing in communities, but then also thinking about us potentially getting a return as investors. So there have been some very interesting public-private partnerships, a lot of things in the affordable housing space where the private sector can take advantage of tax credits, the public sector benefits from additional affordable housing, and then the foundation also benefits from both investing in it, but also then it's tied to the mission. And so there's a lot that's really happening in this space, and it's really dynamic.
That's great. Thank you, Colleen and Kinman. Marisa, did you want to chime in on anything in this area?
Sure. We're seeing, similarly, it's a really dynamic space. I think there's a lot of interest. We get asked about this from a legal perspective, like on the investing side, like legally, are we permitted to incorporate, kind of like maybe socially responsible investing? Is that a problem? And the answer is generally no. As a private foundation with charitable assets, you have to manage your investment assets in a prudent manner. That doesn't mean you have to maximize dollars like at every turn. Like you could take, in theory, like a potential haircut on your overall rate of return if that was enabling you to then invest in assets that were more mission aligned. That's a very high level. I think I did mention in our my earlier session, there's a MIFA governs kind of prudent management of charitable funds being invested, but it has flexibility to take into account a foundation's mission and how assets relate to that mission. So if you're wanting to incorporate ESG or DEI concepts into your investment approach, there's a lot of talk in this area. I think investment advisors are really doing their best to facilitate that. And from a legal perspective, you might want to go and look at your investment policy, update it. But it's something that from a legal perspective, the laws give you the flexibility to do. In terms of implementing DEI and grant making, I think what we're getting lots of questions about right now, and we don't have great answers for, there's been a lot of fallout and follow up to the Supreme Court decision striking down affirmative action. And while affirmative action case was about very specific federal laws applicable to school admissions, but it's kind of that general concept of, I think, ideas of what we consider discrimination. I think we were previously understood to not mean efforts to undo maybe kind of systemic, to undo the damage of, historically disadvantaged groups of persons. And so to have the Supreme Court say that, taking race into account for college admissions, I think people are now concerned about what other lawsuits might be brought if you're taking race into account or similar protected classes into account in your grant making activities or other programmatic activities. And it's, we don't know yet exactly how, these are things people are writing articles about and think pieces about. But I think we're going to continue to see, and we are seeing more lawsuits in this space on account of how that affirmative action case came out.
Well, and you and I talked a little bit about that a couple of days ago, because some of us were at a couple of conferences last week, and it came up at both conferences in terms of the affirmative action decision. And one was a community foundations, one was private foundations. So it definitely is in the foundation space in the context of grant making and how that could be something that foundations need to think about in the future, knowing, like you said, that decision was very specific to educational institutions. But just thinking about, even our Moss Adams Foundation, we have very specific goals and targeted assistance towards a specific, really just trying to grow our diverse candidates, at a lower level than even the college level, at the high school level. And so very much targeting giving scholarships, for example. I think that's really the specific areas in the scholarship area where we just need to pay attention and like you said, read those articles and see what comes about in the future on that. All right, we just have a few minutes left. There was one question in the Q&A that I think is a pretty quick one that we might just be able to tackle. And I think this goes back to the purchase of a building. So how should foundations treat sublease income? I don't know if you want to take that, Maggie, since you talked about the income side of things.
Yeah, I think, you would want to definitely review all your facts before you really understood, any implications or possible implications from just receiving income. I think it depends who the subleasor is a key question. Whether there's debt on the property, if there's debt, that typically taints it for unrelated business income purposes. So I think evaluating that with, your CPA and really thinking through the different, how much income, how are you generating it, is important to really assess what, how that should be treated.
Great, thank you. Well, thank you to all of our panelists, and thank you to everyone who's attended our second annual Private Foundation Conference. I can't believe it's over, but I'm sure that our producer and our marketing folks are relieved and they get some break. And with that, I'll turn it over to Amy to close us out.
Yes, thank you, Wendy. It is a relief. And thank you to the Moss Adams presenters, Jennifer, Colleen, Kinman, Maggie, and also to Marisa from Davis, Wright, Tremaine for joining us. This was a great discussion to conclude our 2023 Private Foundation Conference. And to our audience, we hope that you found value in our sessions. Please provide your feedback in the link provided on your screen so we can make improvements and adjustments where needed for next year's conference. And thank you for joining us. Take care, everyone.